of the climate friendly and equitable communities rulemaking process. We're so grateful for all of the time that you have all invested going forward. And today is going to be the last planned meeting of the Rulemaking Advisory Committee process, certainly not the last part of the public process or last opportunity to comment on the rules, but this is really a milestone meeting and we thank you all for being here. I'll go over, and I'm Sylvia Chiborowski, helping to facilitate the process, and I'll go over the agenda and objectives in just a minute here, but first I'm going to hand it over to LCDC Chair Robin MacArthur to just give us a little bit of a welcome and opening.
Thank you, Sylvia. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the last meeting of the Rules Advisory Committee. On behalf of the full Land Conservation and Development Commission, I really want to thank you for all the effort, attention, and focus you have spent on these rules over the past year and a half. It's been a long haul. And from a personal standpoint, I can tell you that I've listened into many of these meetings, and I've also read the comments that you've submitted both in this context as well as at the commission. Also heard your voices at the commission, and I want to assure you that your voices have been very important. They have been heard, and that hopefully they are reflected in the evolution of the rules. I want to take a moment and really give some kudos to DLCD staff. This is just, they've been working really night and day behind the scenes to get to reflect your voices in the rules and to really lean in and translate your viewpoints into rules that make sense, that are actually implementable on the ground, and that ultimately result in climate-friendly and equitable communities in Oregon. And this is no small task, as you all well know. It's very, very difficult. We're not there yet. We have several commission meetings to go, and I'll talk about that in just a moment, to evolve these rules, and they'll continue to evolve throughout this process. One thing we've heard many things, obviously, but one thing we've heard loud and clear from local jurisdictions that they do, in fact, need resources to do this work. And Director Rue and I have been working since day one of the launch of these rules to work with other agencies to try to find those funds. And I'm really thrilled to say that today, later on today, Director Rue and I appear before the Oregon Transportation Commission to request funds for this effort for local jurisdictions to do this work. So if you feel like you want to tune into that, it's that the commission meeting, the Oregon Transportation Commission meeting today at 2, I think, is our time that we're going to speak. Going forward, although this is the last RAC meeting, we have 4 months between now and the time of proposed adoption. And in those 3 months, we have 4 months, excuse me, we have 3 commission meetings. We welcome your input in those settings. I know that the rules will continue to evolve with input from today. And I suspect that staff will also be reaching out to jurisdictions and others as they try to really hone in on the right language to put in those rules between now and adoption to really evolve those rules further. So this is not the end, although it is the final meeting of the RAC. It is not the end of the process. It's really kind of almost midpoint as we continue to hone those rules to get them as good as we can before adoption. So again, thank you, really. It's just, I know it's a lot of work for all of you to be here, to spend your time in this way, to really think through this work and try to figure out the best way to hone those rules to result in quality communities on the ground. So thank you very much for your effort, and I'll turn it back to Sylvia.
Yeah, thank you so much, Robin. So I'll just walk us through what we're planning to do today. So, you've been with the Rulemaking Advisory Committee for now 11 meetings, and staff has been hearing your input and updating the draft rules. And today is really an opportunity to walk through where the rules are at this point and hear from you on whether you think these rules really accomplish the goals of the climate friendly and equitable communities process. So I'll just share the agenda for just a moment here so you can kind of see the topics. We're going to have 4 key topics on the rules themselves. And the first, we're going to start with an update on the climate friendly areas. So looking through the rules for the climate friendly areas and really asking you whether these are on track to move forward. We're going to have an update on the metropolitan greenhouse gas reduction targets and want to hear your input on that. Then we'll have a break and then hear the updated rules on parking management and supporting electric vehicle charging. And again, want to hear if these seem like they're on track to move forward. And then we'll have an update on the Transportation System Planning Division 12 rules. Then we'll have another break and we'll end the meeting with talking about the impact statements. So as you know, with any rulemaking, the impact statements are required. So staff will briefly review the fiscal impact statement, the housing impact statement, and kind of the newly required racial equity impact statement. And get your perspectives on those pieces, and then just wrap up with the thank you, next steps. And at the end of the meeting, you know, we are going to open the floor just to anyone that wants to share how this process has been for them or just any final thoughts. So be thinking about that too, if there's, you know, anything that you would like to say towards the end of the meeting. Throughout the topics for the rules, we're going to have some specific discussion questions just to hear if these are on the right track. And we're going to be using the Jamboard throughout those conversations. And we're going to do it a little bit differently than we've used Jamboard in the past. We really want to keep having a discussion in the room, but then also have the Jamboards open so that people can provide written input and just another forum for you to provide your ideas. So we won't have the Jamboards up and we won't be looking at them kind of in silent listening and thinking mode. It'll be more of a discussion with the Jamboard on the side, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later. But you know, if you have any troubleshooting issues with the Jamboard, we can resolve that through the chat. And just some process reminders. Today's meeting is being recorded and will be posted on the project website later, and we can put that link in the chat. Members of the public that are listening in, you are always welcome to submit your written comments to staff at the project website, dlcd.cfec@state.or.us. When we get to our discussion portions of today's meeting, we'll just ask folks to raise your hand to get in the queue to speak. And just a reminder where the raise hand button is on your platform. If you kind of hover over your screen and see the black bar at the bottom, there's a reactions button. And when you click that, there's a raise hand icon. And if that's not working, just send me a chat and I can get you in the queue. And if you're joined by phone only, just press *9. We do have a 4-hour meeting with 2 scheduled breaks, but please, you know, take care of yourself as needed. If you need a break, get up, get off screen, please do that. When you are speaking though, of course, we love video and being able to see each other's faces as we live in this virtual world these days. And I think that's it in terms of just process reminders. Before we get into the rules on the climate friendly areas, I do want to hand it over to DLCD staff for just some updates and review of the schedule. So over to you.
Thank you, Sylvia. My name is Bill Holmstrom from DLCD staff, and thank you all again for being here today. And I'm just going to go over a few quick things here before we get started with Kevin talking about the climate-friendly areas. We'll talk about the schedule real quick, and Chair MacArthur talked about this a little bit about where we're heading right now. At the top there, you see today's what we're doing today, our kind of final advisory committee meeting. We'll be talking about the rules and the impact statements. On February 3rd, LCDC will have a meeting where they'll be receiving a briefing from us on these draft rules, like we've been doing all along with the commission the last year plus on our progress. And we have a few outstanding questions, I think, things that have come up here or in different with different stakeholders that we want to make sure that we review with the commission. And when those when the commission staff report goes out, probably tomorrow, everybody will be able to see that staff report and the questions we intend to talk about with the commission, but I don't think there'll be any surprises there. In the month of February, we're going to be hunkering down to really hone down and refine these rules. We're going to be having our review with our counsel, with Department of Justice attorney, to review all the different pieces of the rules and make sure that, you know, we're dotting our I's and crossing our T's. all along the way, we've consulted with counsel to make sure that there's certain elements where we have questions that we've been able to resolve those. He's been able to see parts of the rules ahead of time and review them, but in general, he wants to see everything all together at the end and make sure it all works together. So that's what we're going to be doing in February, and we may make some tweaks based on his input, but in general, we're pretty confident because we've been consulting with him all along that there's nothing like completely illegal in the rules, in the draft rules. So, but we're have that final review just in case. And near the end of the month, we're going to work with our rules coordinator, Casaria Taylor, to make sure that the rules are in shape to submit to the Secretary of State. We'll submit those, and then they're published. Usually, they're always published on the first day of the month, so they'll be published on March 1st in advance of the Commission's first hearing, which is going to be at their March 1st or April 1st. That's when their meeting is scheduled. On one of those 2 days is when they're going to have their first public hearing. And if it's on that second day, we're not fooling. It really is going to be that day. So that will be the first opportunity formally to provide the Commission feedback and in a formal hearing setting. Of course, they've been hearing comments all along. They've already received a lot of comments and feedback in advance of the February meeting. They will listen to people come testify at their February meeting. That's a briefing. It's a little bit different setting than the formal hearing, which is the first one is in March. Then we have a couple months before their next hearing, which is scheduled for May 19th and 20th. That will be their final hearing, and we expect the Commission to adopt the rules at that time. All the way up until the point that they adopt it, we expect that we're going to be making tweaks that will have the ability to make changes here and there. Nothing's written in stone. Nothing's final until gavel comes down in May, and they actually adopt those rules. And then, they can always make changes in the future. It's the Commission's rule; they can change it. So, I just want to, the draft that's there today, I don't want people to think that we're stuck with it, because there are tweaks and changes that we can make in the future. So that's our schedule. I do see a hand up from Jeremy.
Hey, thanks a lot, Bill. Quick question. I saw somewhere that like a work session scheduled for next week as well.
Sure.
Is that true? And can you tell us a little bit more about what that's about? That's the first question. Second question is, if we wanted to get a letter or comments into the Commission prior to their February 3rd meeting, what's the deadline to do that? Thank you.
Sure, absolutely. So for your first question, yes, the Commission is holding a work session next Tuesday on the 25th. That's an opportunity for staff to talk with the Commission outside of the regular Commission meeting, provide some background information, answer questions from the Commission. That doesn't necessarily take away from the time at their Commission meeting where they might want to be hearing testimony and getting into some certain guidance. The sideboards on that meeting are they will not be receiving public testimony at their work session. That's what their regular meeting is for. The other sideboard is the Commission doesn't have an opportunity to deliberate or make decisions or provide guidance to staff at that. That's really just an opportunity for them to hear from staff, to ask questions. So all those other things have to happen at their regular meeting. That's my understanding. And if Casaria or Kirsten or someone else wants to correct something I got incorrect there, please do so. But I think that's generally the rules on how that works. That's really, there's so much stuff here. We want trying to give the Commission an opportunity to do some of that learning and background work and kind of get into questions outside of the regular Commission meeting opportunity. As far as deadlines, we accept, my understanding, we accept written testimony all the way up to the day of the meeting. The earlier, the better. Kirsten, I see your hand up.
You're exactly right, Bill. I'm sorry to cut you off.
No.
We will have a supplemental packet. So it's a matter of how well do you want the Commission to be able to absorb the information? So Jeremy, if you're able, I would recommend to you and anyone else, if you could send in comments or testimony by, sorry, I just had the calendar up, by Thursday next week, the 27th, we will have a supplemental packet going out that day, or the 28th. Esther does advance testimony, right up until the time, but the commissioners are receiving a lot of information. They'll be receiving their first, as everyone probably knows, the packets are posted 2 weeks before the meeting. So given that Monday was a holiday, this is an exception. Everyone doesn't necessarily know that. We will be posting materials for commission Friday this week. Normally like to do 2 weeks, but we need that extra time also given kind of staff coming and going with pandemic. So if folks can submit their testimony by the 27th, that's perfect. It just gives commission more time to digest. That would be my recommendation. And I think, Bill, you're exactly right on, the work sessions, certainly public information, folks are welcome to view, but commissioners are advised to just refrain from deliberation, but that's why we do notice it as a public meeting to be on the safe side. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions about the schedule? So one other thing real quick, I want to talk about last month in December, a number of you worked with us and participated in one of our 14 meetings. And actually we definitely had more than that. We gave presentations to other folks and had some other meetings with lots of other different people. But in terms of practitioner roundtables that we held around the state in regional settings, we held 6 of those around the state with folks who are on the advisory committee, many of your colleagues in local government that work in transportation and land use. We had, just fabulous participation in each of those. Opportunity to really get into the weeds of some of these things, answer some questions, and hear from a wider set of folks than are just on the advisory committee. We held 6 of those, and then we held 8 topic-specific work groups in 5 topics. We held 3 of them twice, or had a second meeting for 3 of those topics, and a little bit more. But we'll talk a little bit more, I think, about that later this meeting. And there's more information, I think, in your packet about what those were, but and there's, in fact, your packet has a summary of each of these meetings, and you can actually click on and find the video if you really want to go back and break out the popcorn and watch one of those meetings. You're welcome to do that. But just to say, we've been busy. We've been having a lot of meetings. We've been a lot of presentations with folks. We gave a presentation, yesterday about the rules to a group in the Portland metropolitan area. We're giving a presentation to another city council next week. We've got stuff all the time that we're doing. So we've been pretty busy. And I think that's all I have for right now to share. And of course, we're going to be talking more about the details of the rules, what's changed, and kind of things where maybe we expect still some more work to happen as we discuss throughout the topic areas of the meeting today. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill, for that. And any other updates from DLCD? Okay. Then with that, I think we can move into rule updates on the climate friendly areas. And I'll hand it over to Kevin in just a second to just provide some updates on kind of what's changed and where the rules are at this point. And then after that, we'll have some time for open discussion with this group. And also we'll open up the Jamboard and we'll talk about how to use that after Kevin provides his brief kind of presentation here. And just to get you thinking, the questions that we really want to focus on today in the discussion is just asking you, we know that the climate friendly area rules were really meant to help create desired walkable mixed use communities. So do you think that these rules are going to get us there? And what part of the rules do you think is most likely to support or impede that goal of creating walkable mixed use communities? So with that, I'll hand it over to Kevin.
Thank you, Sylvia, and good morning, everyone. Kevin Young, DLCD staff, he, him pronouns. Happy to be with you this morning. And I do want to extend a special thank you to those folks who attended the climate friendly area work groups. It was really very, very helpful to be able to kind of roll up our sleeves and work together on these changes. And I feel that we've kind of worked through a number of issues. I'm not going to be here today to say these rules are perfect as written, but I do want to step through some of the key changes that we've made since we looked at the last draft of the rules on climate friendly areas. Bill, could you advance to the next slide, please? Perfect. So starting out with the Division 8, the housing rule revisions, this is a key issue, particularly this first item. And essentially, you know, the concern that has been expressed is how climate-friendly area designation will operate in the context of, you know, the larger context of how local governments plan to meet their residential needs, all residential needs, which is required under statewide planning goal number 10, as well as a host of statute and administrative rule. And so,
Not surprised.
what we have done with the latest draft is to better differentiate how a local government is to plan and zone climate-friendly areas based on zoning capacity. And at the same time, how residential land needs over time will continue to be determined based on actual development activity in residential areas. It's a key issue. I know it's confusing, but clarifying that distinction is very important. And we'll talk a little bit later about sort of the methodology for local governments to estimate, you know, zoning capacity for housing units. But that's kind of the crux of the distinction between how the CFAs get determined, designated, and how cities or local governments will continue to plan to meet their housing needs over time. One other change we made to Division 8 is to include actions taken to promote the production of housing accessible to persons with disabilities to the required analysis of fair and equitable housing outcomes. So you may recall we already had required reporting on affordable housing, development within climate-friendly areas, and, you know, tools to facilitate affordable housing development. We also see the need to provide the same focus on production of housing accessible to persons with disabilities. So we've added that into the rule as well. Next slide, please. All right, so going back to Division 12, so within our transportation planning rule, we've made a number of revisions. First of all, in terms of the effective dates, we reorganized this section. So the dates are basically the same. The key change that we made here is, if you recall, the prior draft had required local governments to identify CFAs, and it was unclear whether that action was a land use decision or not. What we've done in the revised rules is to clarify that that first step, the CFA study, is not a land use decision. And so local governments would have a year to study potential CFA areas, and we have outlined the requirements for items that need to be studied in a later rule, 0315, which I'll talk about in a minute. But essentially, it's the study that's required. It's not an appealable decision, but it is something that would be subject to department review and public review and comment. Following that, we have zoning and comp plan amendments would be due 1 year later by June 30, 2024. Also, within this rule, we've clarified that requirements within the metro region are different. As you recall, metros to adopt those requirements for basically the town and regional centers by December 31, 2024, and then cities and counties that have yet to adopt would need to adopt those Region 2040 centers by December 31 of 2025. All right, next slide, please. All right, also a reorganization to section 0310 regarding climate-friendly areas. So this reorganization makes it clear that, you know, basically establishes certain locational requirements for climate-friendly areas, including minimum dimensions for CFAs. That was an issue. I know it's been an issue that's been talked about quite a bit. And we're trying to balance concerns with, you know, making sure that these things work properly. And so I will note that we've added in some criteria for exceptions that may be warranted to those minimum dimensional standards for CFAs. Also in this section is a clarification that only county areas that are provided with urban water, sanitary sewer, stormwater, and transportation services within an identified UGB or urban growth boundary are subject to the climate-friendly area requirements. It's a complicated concept, but you know, I think it's important so that people understand what county areas we're talking about there. Next slide, please. Okay, so in 0315 of the transportation planning rule, so section 2 or subsection, I'm not sure, whatever, subsection 2 provides that detail for how to calculate average buildable residential area in a climate-friendly area. So again, this gets back at the that issue of how does a city basically figure out how much housing can be accommodated in a CFA in a way that doesn't conflict with existing rules for how they plan for all residential needs. This provides a more detailed methodology for how to do that. I'll also note in the packets, there's an item, I can't remember which number it is, but basically sort of a story problem, if you will, of here's how a local government would calculate CFA area. Here's how a local government would implement CFA requirements in conjunction with urban growth boundary expansions as well. So try to flesh that out a little bit more based on the current draft of the rules. Section 4 details the information and analysis required in the climate-friendly area study. That's within the first year. What work do local governments need to do to study those climate-friendly areas? I think the information in that study should be familiar. It's I think basically the same as what we had required with the designation, including that study of the potential for displacement and identification of mitigation actions that would offset that potential displacement. And then section 5 provides the process for public and department review and comment on the climate-friendly area studies. So again, when those are submitted to the department will make those publicly available, and there will be a certain time period for the department and for the public to review and comment. Essentially, we take that comment, goes back to the local government, and that is that. It is not a land use decision. It's kind of a check-in, if you will, on, okay, what's the progress being made and what do people think about, you know, the information in the study and the work within the study. Next slide, please. And then made a number of changes in the land use requirements for climate-friendly areas. First of all, we added more flexibility and determination of allowed housing types in climate-friendly areas. We added an allowance for attached single family, but also beyond that, allow the local government to make the call of, hey, if there's a housing type that can meet minimum density standards, then it can be allowed in these areas. So a little more flexibility there. We have brought back the maximum 350-foot block length standard that, you know, in conversation, it is an important building block for how climate-friendly areas should be planned and designed. We have included it with that a redevelopment threshold, so it's clear to local governments that at what point in redevelopment in a current area in a CFA would that block length standard come into play. There's also provisions that would allow, in lieu of a full street improvement, pedestrian and bicycle connections, you know, through a block as another option. We've also clarified that minimum densities would not be applied for, say, a mixed-use building, so long as the building is of sufficient size. So a 2.0 FAR is a floor area ratio, and essentially that means that the area of the building needs to be twice the area of the development site. So if you're building something on a 10,000 square foot property, the building, if it's 20,000 square feet or greater in size, we wouldn't apply minimum density. And what that does is it allows for some residential development in a mixed use building, without kind of setting the floor at a very high minimum density. Because what we don't want to do is to exclude potential residential development in a mixed use context. So that's what that standard does. We've also basically compressed the standards for cities that are over 10,000 or 100,000 in size. Those are now the same as the standards for cities that are greater than 50,000, but less than 100,000. So essentially, there wasn't a lot of distinction in the earlier frame, setup of standards, and so we've kind of put those together. And one key issue here, the last point, is that we have changed how local governments can designate climate-friendly areas. So, we've heard a lot of concern from people about how, the development market right now in our area is really not building things at these heights, and this may not, some of these standards might not be realistic. This new provision, it still requires those local governments to establish a climate-friendly area, sort of what I'll call a primary climate-friendly area, to basically consistent with the maximum standard for that city size. But it allows the local government flexibility in other CFA areas. So if they choose to designate more than one CFA, they might pick a less intensive standard for other climate-friendly areas. The trade-off, of course, is that there's still the requirement to accommodate at least 30% of residential units. And so as cities kind of look at those standards, they may need to designate more areas at a lower intensity than at a higher intensity, but there's more flexibility built into the rule in that regard as well. I think that may be it. I'm not sure. Next slide, please. Okay. Yep. And that's it. I don't know. Yeah, if we just want to start the discussion, I don't know if there are any clarifying questions before we do that. It's kind of a lot.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Kevin.
Yeah.
If we can, I think we can definitely take some clarifying questions. I do also just want to acknowledge, where we are in this process and just the reality of where we are. It was a long weekend. The packet came out. It was many hundreds of pages, or almost 200 pages. And there's Omicron surge, which we know folks are dealing with. So we appreciate that folks may not have had time to go through everything in the packet. And DLCD staff really does hope to get as many substantive comments as possible today to keep, moving along and meeting the timelines. And I think later today, DLCD staff can clarify a little bit more about kind of exactly when comments would be needed to help inform the process moving forward. Is that fair?
It sure is. Yes. Thanks, Sylvia.
Kevin, I think that's right. And we really need folks' comments as soon as practical. We have heard via the chat that RAC members are experiencing somewhat of direct, anxiety, sort of stress around trying to review this and make informed comments on this last full suite. So I'm going to go back to my 8 reallys. I want to turn to you guys on that, but the really appreciate everyone keeping both feet really focused on this comment period from the RAC. You guys have been tremendously helpful constructing the evolved rules. I think that, and the staff today is laying out how they have evolved and are evolving. We have obviously many missions here, and one is to respond to the overriding charge, which is to reduce GHGs in the land use and transportation sector by the goals set forth in statute and rule. So with all that, however, and we do need to submit our packets to legal review by the end of the first week in February, it is possible, and staff have been clear about this, so I'm just reiterating, for the rules to continue to evolve within the parameters set by the Secretary of State filing, which is all the charge you've been working on, so no surprises. We expect wiggle within that charge and sideboard. It is possible to schedule a sort of conclusionary RAC meeting in between the public hearings to obtain additional sort of RAC guidance on implementation, particularly. I don't think you'd want to see directional changes at that point. You know, no one, you know, so don't hold back. We need comments now. By the end of the first week of so we can submit by the end of the first week of February. So I've posited to staff on the back end, a date by which we'd really like RAC comments from this discussion. You all are accustomed to receiving a survey afterwards with a period of time in which to respond. So that's nothing new. We just want to put a fine point on when that would be. But I just also want to acknowledge, we're all feeling it. You're all very, very dedicated to this, and we're grateful. It takes a complete village on this effort to develop rules that are implementable. So thank you for keeping the focus. We want to collect as much information today and going forward, but just wanted to recognize that staff and the facilitation team and the commissioners acknowledge that really fine-tuning meeting between the first and second hearing could be very productive for the continued improvement of the package. So just wanted to acknowledge that. Thanks to the RAC member who, RAC members who have expressed that concern to us. And with that, I will go back on mute.
Thank you, Kirsten. And I do see a number of hands up. Before we get to the discussion, though, I do just want to open up the Jamboard too as another way to provide your thoughts. And I don't know if the hands up here are clarifying questions or substantive comments, but that's fine. We can get to all of that. Bianca, I think I'll turn it over to you if you don't mind sharing your screen. We definitely want to have as much conversation with the group today, but we also want to have the Jamboard as just another way to provide your thoughts because it's a big group and we want to get as many comments as possible. So we have kind of 2 questions here for the Jamboard, and Bianca, I'll hand it over to you to explain how this works.
Yeah, thank you, Sylvia. I'll just provide a brief tutorial for those who are unfamiliar with Jamboard. If you just look at the bar on the left hand of the screen, we ask that you click this icon, the sticky note icon, and put your sticky note like this, right? And please refrain from using any of the other tools on this bar. As your notes come in, we have DLCD staff moving them around, so don't worry about that. If you see right here, there's a clear frame. If you accidentally press this button, please make sure to do an undo because we won't be able to get back those responses. And we have 2 frames, and if you could just stay within these 2 frames, that would be helpful because if you click forward, it adds another frame and we can just end up with too many frames. But yeah, that's it for the tutorial. Thanks, Sylvia.
Yeah, great, thank you. And if you just want to go back to one of the slides with the questions on it, so for RAC members, the Jamboard link is in the chat right now. If you have trouble accessing it, just send me a chat message. But the questions that we have posed for the group today really are, do you think that these climate-friendly area rules will help to create desired walkable mixed-use communities, which is, the whole goal here? And are there any provisions that you specifically want to point to that you think you really want to lift up or that you're struggling with, that would be most likely to either support or impede the goal of creating desired walkable mixed-use communities? So feel free to post your comments here, and we might be referring to this to bring some of these comments into the conversation throughout the meeting, but we'll go ahead and stop the screen share so that we can have a conversation on the same kind of questions here. So for the group here, any clarifying questions are of course welcome, and then just any thoughts on whether you think the climate-friendly areas are getting us to the overall goal. So Samantha, let's go to you first.
Sure. So I have a clarifying.
Sorry, one more reminder, just say your name and affiliation before you speak as we kind of get to know each other and have the public listening in. Thanks.
Yep, I'm Samantha Bear. I am the Housing Program Director for the Oregon Home Builders Association. I have a question. Well, I have a couple questions and then some comments. The first one goes back to UGB expansion and the example provided in the materials and kind of the overall intent of the department. It appears that we are trying to tie growth opportunities and the amount of land that should come into the growth boundary based upon existing residential development and the type of build out that we're currently seeing. Is that correct?
Yes, it is. That is the current the way the system currently operates, and we are not intending to interfere with that. So cities should be able to continue to plan to meet their residential land needs based on prior housing production, by zone. That will include climate-friendly areas over time, and we hope to see increased housing development in those areas. But yeah, we need to keep that basic framework intact, and I believe the current draft does so.
Okay, I will just say in general with these rules, as well as the density requirements, some of the land use requirements, there's kind of a whole host of, I think, issues with this draft that I'm going to be providing in writing. I am worried about how, if these rules are going in the right direction, if we're trying to also achieve a dual goal of meeting our housing needs and solving our housing crisis. And I am worried that a lot of these rules are potentially going to freeze residential development in many of our communities. I don't believe we've done an analysis of land prices where CFAs are going to be. I think we've asked for that a couple times, but I don't think that has happened yet. And I'm worried about our ability to bring an affordable product to market if we have to have 30% of housing in these CFAs, which we know anecdotally in a lot of these areas is already going to be really expensive. And then also back to the density requirements and some of these other land use rules. I know we've talked about adding flexibility for other forms of housing, but there really is no flexibility or allotment for single family development based upon the rules. And that's even acknowledged in the impact statement. So I'm just feeling like these rules are maybe 2 steps in the wrong direction if we're also trying to achieve housing and housing production and affordable housing production. And I would just ask that I know we got to move these rules forward, but if we could hold back the CFA piece even and take more time on that, it would be really, really helpful. And I know that that's something that will have to be discussed before the commission, but I would just like to open with it and ask for an extension, at least on this part of the rule, so we can also move our housing production forward.
Sylvia, if I may.
Yeah.
This is really a matter for the commission, the timeline, and commission has been very, very clear with us that they intend to adopt final rules in May, Samantha. So we just all need to do the work to develop them adoptable rules in March and May. So we want to continue to work, obviously, work and listen and work and listen and work and listen and transform. But I would, defer to Chair MacArthur if she wants to reiterate the timeline, but I don't think there's any budge on that. Thank you.
Okay, I'll also be making that ask in front of the commission
of course.
As well.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks all. Jeremy, over to you, and then Damien.
Okay, great, thanks. Yeah, I share some of Samantha's concerns, and I think that one of the issues there is sort of just the lack of analysis of how this will actually impact development on the ground. It makes it difficult to ensure that the rules are not interfering with our housing production goals. But that aside, I had a couple of clarifying questions on what Kevin talked about that I want to ask. Kevin, can you describe in a little more detail what those rules would, and sorry, we've got a busy house here, what those rules would be for those CFAs that don't need to be as intensive? What are those rules, and where do we find those? That's one question. And then I have a follow-up question. Thanks.
Sure. It's basically, so for example, a large city, say a city over 50,000, would have to designate a primary CFA to meet the more intensive standards, but then could designate other CFAs basically based on the ones for the smaller cities. So maybe a lower density, lower building height.
Thanks. And then follow-up question. So for a city that either is unlikely to have the kind of development that's envisioned by the CFAs, or that just on the ground in reality doesn't materialize with that, can you just kind of walk us through the process of how that city then is ensured to be able to meet its needs? And one concern I have, and we talked about this before in these meetings, is that because part of the rules are that you need to designate more CFAs if you're not meeting your goals and you need to expand your UGB to meet your housing needs, it doesn't really make a lot of sense if one of the reasons why you're not meeting your housing needs is that the demand for housing in your community is different than the type of housing envisioned by the CFA, and now you're being asked to double down on CFAs. So you're kind of taking land out of development if it's a community where the intensity of development that's envisioned doesn't occur, because that's the only type of development that can occur there now because they have the CFA rules in place. So in that respect, you're almost encouraging a UGB expansion because, you know, if they need single family, but then when they do their UGB expansion, you're asking them to do another CFA. So I just don't quite understand how it works on the ground for a community in which the intensity of a development envisioned here just either isn't realistic or doesn't materialize. Thank you.
You bet. Thanks for the question, Jeremy. You know, it's a complicated issue. You know, I think that is part of the reason why we've sort of adjusted standards to allow local governments to sort of calibrate their CFAs based on where they think the markets are going to respond. But at the end of the day, the rules don't require development in CFAs. They require local governments to zone to accommodate a certain level of residential development. If it turns out these rules are not working, I think it's very likely we'll be going back to the commission and looking at making some adjustments to them. As that operates or doesn't operate, though, local governments, again, will be able to continue to say, every time they're doing their housing needs analyses, let's look at our existing zoning, let's look at the housing production that's happening here, and let's, you know, make a plan for meeting all of our residential housing needs based on the development activity that we've seen. So, you know, there's the example in the packet where it's, okay, well, if you have lackluster production in a CFA, then you assume that level of housing development in a CFA. And then you look at other zones and look at recent housing production in those zones and plan for your land needs accordingly.
Thanks, Kevin. Just the last thing I'll say is that, I mean, I think to the degree that you're talking about rules that allow for taller buildings or allow for more intense development, that's one thing. But to the degree that you have density requirements and other things that, if not met, just will result in the no development, I think it creates a real challenge here. Thanks.
Thanks, Jeremy. And Damien, over to you.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
All right, thank you. Good morning. So I've got some comments on section 315, and I'm kind of taking a deep dive in here as we're talking about it. First, I really wanted to say I really like the change to instead of designating a CFA, look at a study of potential CFAs. Because I think for a lot of communities out of the gate, this will be a first time trying to think about this work. In that vein, I had a clarifying question under 4F regarding plans for achieving fair and equitable housing outcomes. And I wanted to clarify that this would be the work we would do, or the element of our CFA where we would actually outline what the potential impacts might be to certain state and federal protected classes, and then outline actions where, I think the clarifying question is, this is where we identify actions that we're going to take or we think will help mitigate displacement. And so I'd like to get some feedback on that if I'm thinking it's on the right track. Related to that, maybe a simpler question is under 6 regarding the adoption of land use requirements and the climate friendly element, I wanted to inquire if 6A through 6D really represent the sum total of what would be required for a climate friendly element to our comprehensive plan. And that's all I have on climate friendly areas right now. So
Thanks for the questions, Damien. First of all, on 4F, that's exactly right. That is the area where the local government would look at potential for displacement and then identify potential tools that would be used to mitigate for displacement of protected classes. So yes, that is the section. In terms of 6, that's the step where local governments adopt zoning and comp plan amendments to implement the climate friendly areas. That is our intent, is that this would be essentially the information required. If you're seeing a gap or some kind of logical, something that's missing, please let me know. Again, these rules can be improved. So I appreciate the questions.
well, just, the final comment on the climate friendly element, it's one of those things that I've kept making a note to ask about. And I wanted to remember today, since this is the last scheduled RAC meeting. I don't think anything is missing, but the one request I would have on this topic is if time and budget allow, having some kind of tactical guidance created to say, like on a one-pager, here's what you need to include for your climate friendly element. So we've got something to work with and making sure nothing's overlooked. So thank you.
You bet.
Thank you, Damien. And Michael, over to you, and then Matt.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Kevin, for the presentation. And I have to confess, I haven't read all, however many 100 pages of materials we got in our packet. But I did notice that some changes have been made to 0315 regarding accessibility. And first of all, I wanted to give you a shout out and appreciate that. When looking at paragraph 2C, I'm curious, do we think that this is sufficient to actually influence behaviors by cities and developers so that they actually produce accessible units? Is that sufficient, or was more needed? A second question, and I had a focus group discussion with various people with disabilities last week on this topic. And one thing that they requested was if rules can permit that all new housing has at least one 0-step entrance, so that someone who uses a wheelchair would not be excluded from accessing a unit, whether it's a house or an apartment or a condo, whatever it is. And then I also wanted to say I appreciate 0315 paragraph 6B, which requires documentation of accessible units. And so one question I have about that, though, is how are we defining what constitutes an accessible unit? And I may have missed that again in the materials, but do we have a definition of accessibility now? Thank you.
Thank you for the questions, Michael. To get to the first one, so the height, essentially the first provision you cited is allowing a height bonus for, in addition to affordable units, also accessible units. Is that sufficient? I think it's a tool in the toolbox. We think it'll help to move the needle. There may be other tools that local governments can use to incentivize. To answer the second question, the issue that we're navigating, especially in relation to accessible housing units, is our legal authority to require, or lack of legal authority to require, construction that exceeds building code requirements. It's our understanding that we don't have the legal authority to say, hey, you have to build this many accessible units above and beyond what the state building code already requires. There are requirements for accessible units for multifamily, for example. And so what we're really focused on is incentives. What incentives can local governments provide? Can funders provide to build more of these units? So the height bonus is one thing that does that. Frankly, I think a tool that's really going to help with this over time is that housing production strategy work and identifying accessible units specifically in that work, so that local governments are tracking progress on production of accessible units. And to answer I think your last question on is there a definition of accessible units? Yes, it is. I believe it's embedded in that language. I can't remember exactly. I think it's in section 0315, and essentially it does describe the current requirements of the building code for reasons that I just explained.
Thanks, Kevin, Michael. And Matt, over to you. And just a reminder to say your name and affiliation. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Matt Brinkley, Planning Director, City of Medford. So appreciate some of the work that's been done in this section to provide a little more flexibility. Have a question about the block length. City of Medford has citywide block length standards already. They're not 350 feet. So my question is, and you don't have to necessarily answer it at this moment, but why 350 feet? And then I would recommend that you provide some sort of basis for that, because connectivity, it's a good thing for walkability within these neighborhoods, within climate-friendly areas, but it comes at the expense of the development of more units, and it creates more cost for the development of these units. And that's an equity impact, quite frankly, because other residential developments outside of climate-friendly areas will not have to bear the same kinds of costs. So I would urge you to consider that and consider possibly a larger minimum block length standard, unless there's some reason why 350 feet is the absolute largest that you're able to consider. Another comment or kind of a question, I guess, is with the prescriptive sort of route to meeting the density, both for residential units and jobs in 329C. Again, why 40 units, 40 dwelling units, 40 jobs per acre? What's the magic in that? And then it seems like a really large jump from going, in the case of the city of Medford, which is over 50,000 population. That's a big jump from the sort of mandatory minimum residential density of 25 units per acre. So why the significant jump? And I would recommend, or I would ask that you look at something that might be a little more attainable. And finally, I would approach the density issue from, or I'd like for you to consider the density issue from a different perspective, and that is one of equity. When we mandate these minimum densities, and they're mandated, it's not just accommodating that minimum density unless you go to the performance-based part of the rule, which is in 9C. When we mandate that, and we mandate, a minimum 1,000 foot dimension, we are mandating a certain built form, and we're mandating what neighborhoods are going to look like. And those neighborhoods are going to be almost exclusively rental residential. I do appreciate opening up the different housing types to include single family attached, but that is the only homeownership opportunity, practically speaking, that is allowed for in a climate friendly area. And that's a matter of market forces, and also our condo rules here in the state, which make it really difficult to do vertical single family home ownership. But the rule doesn't affect that, and that's what we're dealing with. So what we're essentially saying is that climate friendly areas are going to be inhabited by people who have no chance for home ownership. And they're not going to get to live next door to people who have different housing needs and preferences. That is not my vision for the city of Medford. I want neighborhoods where different kinds of households and different kinds of people with different housing needs are able to live next door to each other. The 1,000-foot minimum dimension and the minimum density standards, even the performance-based one, are going to make that very difficult to achieve. And I think that that is an equity issue. And so when you ask, are these rules moving us toward walkable urban mixed-use neighborhoods? Maybe. Are they going to be equitable? I have a hard time explaining how we're achieving that goal. So if you believe that these rules do that, please provide those findings so that I can explain that to the community that I'm going to be addressing and to my elected and appointed officials.
Thanks, Matt. I'm realizing our time is limited, and you've raised a lot of good points. I think rather than trying to respond, I just like to hear what people have to say. So,
Yeah, and thank you, Matt, for those points. Yeah, still have a few more hands, and we might go to the Jamboard to just look at some of those comments too, to just bring them in. But Jonathan, I'll turn to you first.
Thank you, Jonathan Harker, REC member for the Oregon American Planning Association, retired City of Gresham Planning Director. I'm not going to, I submitted some pretty complex or pretty detailed recommendations on the CFAs. They're part of the Part 2 packet. I was also part of a group effort to submit some more comments on the CFAs that were included in the supplemental packet. You know, I hope those get kind of infused into the Jamboard in some way. You know, the issues that were raised, some of the issues I raised had to do about what does a center look like? How do corridors fit into that? I used some examples from work that was done in Gresham to do the same kind of CFA areas, although we weren't calling them CFAs at those times, the centers, the corridors, those sort of things. We also, some of the issues have to deal with whether or not there's enough anticipation or enough accommodation of residential. Should it be a 50% figure? Should we also be looking at some kind of figure for employment? Because that's what makes mixed use areas work. But I'll let you look at those comments. I'm going to encourage the RAC members to take a look at them. What I wanted to respond to is some of the earlier conversations that are going on. Tomorrow's not going to look too much like yesterday. You know, this is an effort to dealing with climate change. And our urban areas are going to need to look and feel and work differently than they do today in many places. When I hear the conversations about what the market can apply and provide and those sort of things, reminds me of conversations that took place in the 90s when Gresham was going to require or was going to allow for mixed use buildings and actually require in some places that there be commercial on the ground floor. A certain percentage would have to be commercial on the ground floor. And we were told, oh, the market's not going to apply that. We won't be able to do that. They won't be able to build a building code. Who wants to live there? And in fact, you can find many places within a handful of where I live in Northeast Portland that have mixed use buildings, retail on the floor, residential on top. I can also tell you that many of those places are condos. They are ownership opportunities. The new building was just built 3 blocks from me, and those are condos. And there are others that have been there for 10 years that are condos. So I think there will be, we just have to look at what's going to change. You know, we can't continue to think that an urban form that is primarily single family homes is going to be able to address the ability of people to be able to choose to not drive. It just won't. And then that's what we're trying to achieve is the ability of people to not have to drive to get to their destinations. I'm just going to stop there.
Yeah.
Thank you
for that, Jonathan. Appreciate that. Kevin, before we get to the next couple of hands, I see Al and Emma have their hands up. Do you mind just maybe bringing in a couple of the comments from the Jamboard? Alex, if you can share your screen and just, any kind of highlights you want to bring in.
Boy, yeah, I'm afraid I haven't been tracking all of them.
I'm happy to just see a couple that
that'd
I've
be great.
been seeing. I've been seeing some comments about, this seems like it might be on the right path, but some questions about the less intensive standards, some concern about unintended consequences of the rules and housing production, which we've heard in the comments as well, and not having an economic analysis about the effect of rules on housing. Also see comment that the rules don't go far enough. And that they might not create enough of those walkable, bikeable communities that we're wanting to see. And I know there's many other comments, but just want to kind of acknowledge those and encourage folks to keep adding to the Jamboard if you have other thoughts. And I know we're a little bit running on time here. So let's go back to the last couple of hands that we had up here, Al and Emma. So Al, over to you.
Thank you. So yeah, I'm Al Johnson. I'm currently unaffiliated. I'm a retired land use attorney, going back to the 70s when I drafted some of the commission's earliest Goal 10 opinions, for which I'm very proud. And I've basically been living with Goal 10, Goal 12, the housing, transportation, urbanization goals for many, many years. And I just wanted to thank Kevin and for the presentation, and I wanted to see if I could perhaps reassure Jeremy and Samantha a little bit that one of their concerns is that is one that I had until the recent changes to the rule, which basically delink the housing capacity and housing needs analyses process from the CFA capacity process in a way that will allow them to converge over time based on experience. And I think that is what we need to do. What this really does is say, well, the commission is asking local governments to demonstrate things based on fact. They have to produce evidence. And so that's what we're going to do. We're going to see if this works. And we're going to make it necessary to zone these CFA areas. And they're going to be rezoned in the changes that have been made that Kevin described earlier make the CFAs look a lot more market feasible. So I think that convergence is going to happen sooner if it's going to happen at all. The other comment I'd make is that the methodology, that the current methodology is not simply a straight line extension of past market forces. I chaired the residential lands task force for the city of Bend when it was doing its urban growth boundary expansion, and market forces would have dictated a different mix of housing types than we came up with. And the commission sent that back, had sent that back saying, you can't just go with market forces. There is a need for, what the demographics show is that things are changing. What we have right now is a situation where one of the things that I don't want to see continue into the future, which I want to be different in the future, is the growing gap that Oregon and the rest of the country have in Black and white home ownership. And that is acknowledged in almost every community as one of the real keys to long-term stability of households and access to areas of opportunity. And I want to be sure that we continue to be able to accommodate those in the future without having allocated the need in a way that prioritizes transit or even climate change over the great racial disparities that we've created with our past practices. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Al. And Emma?
Thank you. I'll keep this short and sweet. I know we want to wrap this up. I really appreciate all the comments that have been raised about asking why different standards are what they are and what they're based on. I would hope that these rules are based on empirical evidence, but throughout this rulemaking process, I've had big concerns. What you just shared, Al, is helpful to know that this latest draft, which, to be totally truthful, haven't had time to review it with the holiday weekend and everything else going on right now. I wish that there were another RAC meeting after this, but it sounds like that ship has maybe sailed. We'll be talking to commissioners and seeing if there's possibility for more influence in this process to hopefully have rules that are adopted actually implement the goals of this rulemaking. I think some of these rules could be counterproductive, and I'm concerned about that. So 2 specific items. Block length has been reincorporated, and I think that is a great tool in the toolbox to make more walkable communities. I'm curious as to why only block length, and if that's back on the table, if block perimeter would be considered. What we did in the Springfield Development Code update to help implement our TSP policies was to have a pairing of both block perimeter and block length, because that allows more flexibility in having narrow blocks that are still quite walkable, but maybe the end of the block isn't as long, and then it allows for a slightly longer block on one side. Whereas if it's purely a block length, then that kind of constricts some of the ability to meet different contexts in the local community. So that might be an improvement to make. And feel free to look at the Springfield Development Code if you want to see kind of an example of how we've approached that. And then I'm still seeing that there is a minimum width for the climate-friendly areas, and I'm not clear on if that is really addressing a problem, and if it's addressing the problem appropriately. If so, we still have concerns about the feasibility and limitations that that minimum CFA width would create in our community context. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Emma. And Sarah, I see your hand up. We need to move on to the next topic, but maybe just a quick final thought.
Yeah, my final thought, and it can be quick. One is I also do wish we had time for another rec meeting. And I wanted to just chime in to point out that, as everyone knows, there's all this urgency around climate change, and it really can't be overstated, which is why I struggle to say I want another RAC meeting. But I also think that, we've been thinking a lot about, gentrification. We have the gentrification toolkit, and, there's so many things about that are fantastic. There's a lot of concern, rightly so, about unintended consequences of, this strategy or that strategy. I want to say that I agree with others who've made the point that we have to have, this has to be enforceable. It has to be robust to make really any difference. Just as we know that gentrification will occur, we also know we also know that urban heat island is going to continue to be a problem and become a worse problem as we go forward. And I know we've decoupled climate adaptation from this, but I think because we're talking about really, denser urban areas, and also because of equity, and we know that historically marginalized and currently marginalized communities bear the greatest brunt of heat island effects. There's a few different thoughts I have there. I'm not going to go into them in detail. I can write about them, but I think we absolutely do need to be thinking about urban heat island in these rules, because it's just such an obvious consequence and something we need to be mitigating for. And some kind of decision support tool, like a model or something, because I just hear so much kind of confusion and uncertainty about what's even, what the vision is even. Unfortunately, I still hear a lot of that, and I'm sure you do too. So those are my thoughts. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sarah. I appreciate that and everyone's comments here. So let's move into the next part here. We'll have a rule update and overview of the metropolitan greenhouse gas reduction targets. So Cody, I'm going to hand it over to you to provide kind of a brief presentation, and then we'll have some time for questions and discussion. And again, we'll have a Jamboard. So we'll walk through that when we get there. So over to you, Cody.
Thank you, Sylvia. Hello, everyone. Great discussion. Cody Meyer with DLCD, Land Use Transportation Planner. Yeah, I just want to give a quick walkthrough, just to kind of thumbnail what we're talking about here on the greenhouse gas reduction targets, scenario planning, and the connection to the transportation system plans. So just to refresh is, how we started was direction from Governor Brown for DLC and ODOT to make amendments to our rules to direct changes to the local transportation plans of the metropolitan planning areas to meet the greenhouse gas reduction goals. The commission kind of detailed that a little bit for us at the beginning of the RAC with their charge to help do that, to prioritize and select the projects within TSPs that would generally support achieving those targets. Next slide, please. And how this kind of all just fits together, I think this is kind of a helpful kind of global overview, is that, we have as a state legislatively required greenhouse gas reduction goal in general from all sources, trains, planes, automobiles, farming equipment, what industry, heating, what have you. We have the statewide transportation strategy developed through ODOT and numerous stakeholders that really fine tune that to just the transportation sector. And as we know, it's transportation is almost 40% of the greenhouse gas emissions in our state. We've not been doing as well as some sectors in cleaning up our emissions. A lot of work has been done in the electric system to clean that up, but we continue to kind of go in the wrong direction. And getting even more detailed into the orange is kind of what we're working on here. It's just that we have set as a part of the same package as the STS that we have Division 44, the Metropolitan Greenhouse Gas Reduction Targets. So these are looking at just the household travel component of transportation. So we're not looking at trains and planes. We're just looking at kind of automobiles and personal household travel, which actually makes up a significant amount of the emissions that come out of that. Now, the work that we're doing here in this effort is really like dialing that down and making the connection to our regional greenhouse gas targets to the local transportation system plans. So that's been a lot of the work in Division 12, aiming things at achieving those targets. Next slide, please. So just in general, the targets in Division 44, they're set for the actions that are above and beyond fleet fuel technology changes. So things that the state and federal government are working on for electric vehicles, cleaner fuels, those things are not in the wheelhouse of local governments. And so those are taken out. And so really what the targets are VMT or vehicle miles traveled targets. In the past, we've used regional modeling tools, Green Step, Vision Eval, they're more sketch planning tools. They the rules don't require a financial constraint to reach the target. They're more what would it take, develop a plan. But we can use the travel modeling tools that TSPs use and RTPs, the regional transportation plans. So that's been some work. I think there's some confusion as to you have to use a sketch planning tool or you can use more of the traditional modeling tools, which we're doing. So of course the TSPs contain the actual projects that affect VMT, and they have a financially constrained list that you have budget available for the next 25 years, or you have a list of things that you need to work on and get money for. Next slide, please. So we've heard a lot on this topic, and I think that we've kind of broke it down into the pros and cons. So we know that the TPR has targets, or we're asking for targets for TSPs, and a lot of folks think that those are best applied at the regional level. We have scenario planning process. We should roll it out for everybody. We've only rolled it out for the top 3 MPOs. Some folks think that we should just go to the TSP level and not worry about it. So we're asking you guys, what do you think about this? do our rules go far enough?
Great, thank you, Cody, for that. And Alex, if you don't mind just showing the Jamboard for just a second, just so people can kind of see the questions here. And we'll put a link to the Jamboard in the chat for the Metropolitan Greenhouse Gas Reduction Targets. Or maybe Bianca, do you mind sharing your screen if Alex isn't able to? All right, so we have 2 questions posed here, and we'll get to hands for clarifying questions and comments, of course. So just asking, do you think the rules are sufficient to meet the direction of the executive order to meet the greenhouse gas reduction target? So do the rules go far enough? And then a second question on the second frame here is, are there any provisions of the rules that you think are most likely to support or impede that greenhouse gas reduction goal? So encourage you to add some sticky notes here with any thoughts and comments you want to make, and we can take some hands on those same questions or just any clarifying questions. So Julie, I see your hand up.
Hi, Julie Warnicki with the City of Salem, Transportation Planning Manager. And I would say that I think the scenario planning requirements specifically for the Salem-Kaiser area are going to delay and impede our ability to actually take quick action. We have recently done scenario planning for the City of Salem through the Our Salem process, and we are launching on adoption of that, and then we're ready to roll right into updates to our transportation system plan that will support not only the Our Salem policy objectives, but they align closely with the climate friendly equitable community policy objectives. Inserting the requirement for the scenario planning to happen essentially at the same time is going to complicate, confuse, and likely delay our ability to implement changes in our transportation system plan. And so I would encourage that requirement be either removed or significantly delayed so that we can make changes to our transportation system plan and then see how those play out. Anyway, that's my comment.
Thanks, Julie. I should mention that we really at some level need to connect these regional greenhouse gas targets to local transportation system plans. The TPR requirements require that the plans be developed to meet the VMT reduction of the greenhouse gas reduction targets. And so, just at some level, we are going to have to do some coordinating work to figure out what do we think together as a region. We have regional projects, highway projects, road projects, transit projects. The assumptions that one city makes really, and in your case, what happens in Salem has a huge effect on what happens in Kaiser and the travel there. So we do have some level of coordination involved.
And I understand that, and we do already do coordination through our regional transportation plan, but just in the specific case of where we are with things, with the transit district is right now working on their long range 20-year first ever long range transit plan. We really want to be able to get those things that are actionable for the city in place, and we really feel like the regional scenario planning with its engagement and other things is going to be a distraction from doing what we can do. And so yeah, I would implore, the other option, I guess, is that we could, as a region, submit a work program, a work plan under one of these rules that maybe we suggest a much longer timeline than what is currently there to allow us to do our TSP first.
Yeah, thanks, Julie. Jonathan, over to you.
Thank you. Again, I'm still Jonathan, OEPA, retired Gresham Planning Director. I submitted comments on Division 44. They're in the Part 2 packet. There are similar comments I noticed from Mary Call McCurdy and others in the supplemental packet or the Part 2 packet. My suggestion was to not do the scenario planning that's now planned for Central Lane or for Kaiser Salem or Salem Kaiser, that it would be better to utilize the resources that are going to be done for scenario planning to instead complete the comp plan amendment process, the land use amendment process, the TSP updates that are required in the Division 12 changes. And they're similar to what Julie just said. It doesn't seem that it seems like what has to happen to update the TPR in Division 12 will accomplish what is intended to happen in Division 44. So go ahead and let's go ahead and get our TSPs updated. Let's go ahead and get the land use pieces in place. Then we can revisit whether or not we want to do some scenario planning or some regional planning to see how things are going in terms of the target. Cody also mentioned that there's the fleet and those other things are not, the fleet and the fuel efficiency are not part of it yet. It's still in Division 44. It's still in the part that says, here's what your land use plan is supposed to say. And I don't know, so that's I guess I would agree with Julie that there's really not the urgency should be on getting the cities and the urban part of the counties in compliance with Division 12. Then you can come back and revisit whether or not you need to do scenario plannings to aggregate the changes that have taken place and how well they meet the targets for vehicle miles traveled reductions. So thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Can I ask a clarifying question? Jonathan, are you suggesting that the rules for the VMT reduction targets in Division 12, are you still in support of those as those are connected to Division 44, or is it just the scenario planning piece that you're thinking we shouldn't do?
Well, I don't think we should do the scenario planning at this time. It's not clear to me if the VMT's reductions are what's tied, and that's what the goals are tied to. That's fine. But cities and counties, as you've said, don't have any impact or effect on how efficient a fuel is, how quickly older vehicles will be taken out of the circuit, out of use and replaced with more efficient vehicles, those sort of things. But those are still seem to be in Division 44 rules. So I'm not sure how the targets work in terms of what you're accomplishing. I just think that the targets need to focus on what cities and counties can do. And that having making sure that we get in place the ability to go ahead and have development that meets the new CFA rules, to have infrastructure for pedestrian, bicycle, transit that accommodate the ability of people to be able to get around without driving is what we should be focusing on, not whether or not not some other process that we don't seem to need to do at this point. I hope that clarifies. I'm not as conversant on what's gone into those the targets that are in the Division 44. But my understanding is there's some assumptions about fleet turnover, efficiencies, and those sort of things. And those are just not part of what cities and counties do.
And just to clarify, those assumptions are in there only to take them off of the table for when you're calculating your work. And so they are truly focused on the actions that cities and counties can do.
Yeah. It's just not clear to me when I read the list of things that the scenario plan or the land use plan is supposed to have, because it talks about those.
Right. Thanks, Jonathan. So maybe
Sure.
just clarity is needed there. All right, Margie and then Rob.
Hi, good morning. I'm Margie Broadway from the Portland metro area, and I appreciate the comments on this thus far. And I know Metro is unique to the different regional areas and cities and counties. I perhaps am countering my colleague Julie, but I respect her comments that Metro has found a lot of value in doing our climate smart analysis and our scenarios as part of our regional transportation plan. It's the one point in time that all agencies have all the information. We have information on projects, we have system information, and doing climate smart at the same time not only just helps from a workload standpoint because you've set the table for the conversation, but it also just helps in terms of really making sure that climate is center and one of the pillars of your primary plan. So whether you're talking at the TSP or the RTP level, I encourage that. I do think, though, I am always sympathetic to time and technical challenges. There's one challenge that I think it is in some of the transportation planning rule. I'm not going to cite the areas, but pedestrian inventory is something that's been incredibly hard. I've worked on it for years. I've talked to Google. I've tried to get LiDAR data, but ultimately getting robust pedestrian inventory usually comes down to getting interns out on the ground and literally counting sidewalks. So that's an area where, like, for example, cities may or may not have the capacity. That doesn't mean you can't go forward with your planning. You just acknowledge where your data is weak or make assumptions in that area. And for Metro, to use example, we do rely on our statewide partners for our fleet assumptions, and it's very helpful. There's other places where we just have built-in assumptions when we run our model, but I wanted to share that with everyone. So thank you for all your work on this. I appreciate it. Thank you, Cody.
Yeah, thanks, Margie. And Rob?
Yeah, hi, I'm Rob Interfeld, Transportation Planning Manager with the City of Eugene. I have a team of about 8 people that work on transportation planning, and we don't even do the regulatory side of it. We do the regulatory side of having to do a TSP, but not responding to development. And we're pretty much wholly focused, maybe a little bit of time working with ODOT on some big projects in our region, but most of our work is just focused on active transportation, including working with Lane Transit District on BRT and other corridors. And so time spent on meeting the kind of requirements of this process in terms of process are going to take us away from that work. And so I just want us to be really careful about, are these all things that we absolutely need to do in order to move the dial? One specific concern I have is around community engagement for the scenario planning. And it's just about, part of it is about confusing the public. So we're going to need to do community engagement for all the land use requirements of this process and plus the TSP update. And this is also requiring community engagement for the regional scenario planning. And I'm just wondering, how are we going to frame that for people in a way that makes sense to them? I mean, it's really hard to engage people in general, including underserved communities. It's a lot of work, and I just want us to be really strategic about it. So I would just encourage the LCD staff to really think about, I just kind of wonder, should the regional scenario planning be more of a technical exercise? And then we do the community engagement as something that happens more deeply at the TSP level. And honestly, if you ask people that live in our area about do they know about the Central Lane MPO, how many of them even know they live in something called Central Lane County, let alone know what an MPO is? So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. And I see hands up from Jonathan and Julie again. Maybe just quick comments, and if there's anything more detailed, talking to Cody offline after today might be the best route to go, just so we can get to the other topics for today. But
Sure.
Jonathan,
Sure. Just real quickly on Margie's point about Metro and the climate smart. And I agree that there was value in doing the climate smart stuff and going forward. I was part of the advisory committee when Climate Smart was done, representing Gresham. But one of the conclusions of the Metro Smart project was that the land uses that were in place already through Title VI on centers was what was needed to happen. And that had already happened. in our situation for the other metropolitan areas, that's not necessarily true. So my thought is you need to get the land use pieces in place first. Then you can come back and do the other work that might be anticipated as part of the scenario planning. I just wanted to clarify that.
Thanks, Jonathan.
Can I just clarify one thing here?
Sure.
The way the staff envisions these rules are that the scenario planning is an umbrella through which the CFAs are identified as a part of that as a necessary first step, that the public engagement would be happening for TSPs, CFAs, that things are tied together in an overall work program. And so I don't think that we see it as these discrete steps that happen in isolation. And I just want to clarify that that's the way we envision this working, so as not to confuse folks, and it doesn't have to be tied through the MPO at all. You can call it, whatever you want, and work, within your city and as a regional project team.
Thanks, Cody. And Julie?
I just wanted to add on to what Rob said in terms of staffing levels. City of Salem, about the same size as City of Eugene, we have 2 transportation planners. And so all of this work is landing on 2 people and takes away from every other thing that we have to do, including applying for grants for funding to do a lot of bike ped projects. So that's where I'm coming from.
Great. Thank you, Julie. All right. And I know there have been a few comments on the Jamboard. Most of them are kind of reiterations of what's already been said in the conversation, but encourage you to put any additional thoughts into the Jamboard. I think we're due for a break at this point. I want to make sure people get a chance to stretch and take care of themselves. So let's get back together at 10:50. And when we do, we'll get into the rules for parking management and electric vehicle charging. So take a break and get back together at 10:50. Feel free to go on mute, turn off your video. See you then. All right, welcome back, folks, to our meeting. Hope you had a quick break there. So we're going to move into the rules for parking management and support of electric vehicle charging. So I'll hand it over to Evan in just a second, and then we'll also have a Jamboard to get your comments and have discussion in the room as well. So Evan, over to you.
Thanks, Sylvia. Evan Manville, Land Use and Transportation Planner, he, him pronouns. Next slide. So we've had a good conversation on a parking reform work group, and I've continued to evolve the rules a little bit. The first thing I did want to highlight, realized that some of the provisions about when some of the things about parking reform would take effect weren't up in the effective dates part of the rules in the O12s. And so, but they were kind of buried in the language in the parking language. So since August, we've kind of said, hey, communities aren't going to enforce these parking mandates or shall not require parking. But that was part of language. It wasn't really highlighted where that date was. So this draft is really saying, hey, when we were saying that, that means that happens pretty much upon the effective date of the rules. And we put in June 30th, 2022. And so those, the parking reforms that we're proposing happening soon after adoption are those that impact those few development types, units under 750 square feet, units for people with disabilities, childcare, et cetera, and a cap of one space minimum for multifamily, as well as those things at 0440, which are those mandates near frequent transit. So that that has kind of been in the draft, but it hasn't been clear in the draft. So we tried to clarify that. So that's the thought on that. And Julie gets a gold star for pointing out that there's a provision in 440 that actually 440 section 3 that would wait to have. So there's some cleanup to do there, but so that's just about unbundling related to 440. So yeah, the rest of it is still clear as clear as it's been, that we're asking folks to implement one of the 3 parking approaches by March 31st, 2023. And we said parking maximums can wait until TSPs are updated. So that was a change. That's the actual change. The other ones are clarifications. Next slide. The second thing the second major thing that I wanted to highlight was we came up with a proposal for how this applies in Metro. And pretty much it's saying it applies in Metro until and unless Metro proposes an alternate approach and LCDC approves the alternative. So giving Metro the ability to do something that meets the same goals and the same things, but until that time, moving forward with a parking reform. And then kind of figuring out, okay, how do the various provisions apply in Metro? The parking maximums in Metro would apply to cities in Metro of over 25,000. And the provisions about parking reform in climate friendly areas would apply in Metro's regional and town centers, which are somewhat equivalent to CFAs. So that's the thought on how we, that's the proposal on how we would apply this in the Metro area, which has been a topic of a lot of discussion. So next slide. Another major change was fleshing out some parking maximums. And we heard this from our work group, was that folks thought it was appropriate to put in more parking maximums. We've had parking maximums for residential in the drafts for a while, but the areas in bold here are kind of the things that have changed in this draft. So again, the purpose of the parking maximums provisions are to really avoid in key areas car heavy uses, and to also nudge the market to rethink their models on how much parking they're providing. So this really, the parking maximums are required to apply only along transit corridors, near rail stops, and in climate-friendly areas. So we ask cities to consider them and adopt them, and we set some certain caps on how high they can go. So we've had that residential cap for a while, and then the commercial. We propose a commercial cap, a kind of mega use cap, and kind of use what a lot of communities have used for a while, which is a percentage of their parking minimums. So because we're changing parking minimums, we kind of have a look back at, hey, where were your parking mandates a little while ago? Back in the envelope, think about 50% greater than that as a maximum. If you, so that's your consideration. If there's some flexibility, if you find that you come up with the wrong number, but that's the proposal per now. And again, the parking maximums pretty much apply upon transportation system plan updates, or if communities choose option 3. So it's a part of option 3, the reduced regulation. If people remember, the option 1 is no parking mandates. Option 2 is the fair policies, and option 3 is just focused on reduced regulation. So if people choose path 3, they would update their parking maximums at that time. Next slide. There are a lot of little tweaks, and I really appreciate those people who spent the time working with me to kind of talk through things. We adjusted the solar tree canopy provisions to apply to parking lots, more parking lots of a 1/4 acre and larger. Realized that there are more tree canopy provisions in existing city codes, so that might not be a major change. We also highlighted that the language that we have about tree canopies needs to be worked on, and so that has not yet been fixed to make it more clear and objective. But we're really trying to figure out what tree canopy provisions can work and actually have the impacts that we want. So hoping to get to that ASAP. There was some concern about the saying, hey, properties that have been vacant can have parking mandates waived under option 3. And said that's really hard. City said, how do we implement that? And so the city of Detroit requires a vacancy registration. And so communities could say, okay, register your property as vacant, and if 2 years later it's still vacant, then parking mandates can be waived. So that's the option, giving communities more ability to require proof of vacancy. The last couple of things are on EV charging. First, we put in a provision saying, hey, if you have direct current fast charging, which is kind of cream of the crop on EV charging, you can provide fewer spaces because that works really fast, and we think we can serve a lot more vehicles for those places with DC fast charging. And I would note that the city of Portland has done extensive work on their EV charging, and we're trying to meet with them to harmonize to make sure it meshes well with our draft rules. So there may be a few more tweaks coming up. So that's kind of the highlights of what's changed since the last one. Again, there have been minor tweaks as your packet shows, and the bold text throughout the 0400s, but really wanted to get people's feedback on the parking maximum provisions and the metro approach, as well as anything else that people wanted to share their thoughts on.
That's great. Thank you so much, Evan. And we can get into discussion in just a second. And I also just want to recognize that we've heard a lot from cities and planning professionals, and really want to make sure that we're hearing from everyone in this committee. So encourage members from the community-based organizations and other perspectives to also really bring their voice into the conversation so that we're hearing from everyone. This is a really important milestone meeting, and want to make sure we're including all voices. And I think let's go ahead and pull up the Jamboard, if you don't mind, Ryan, this time. I used the wrong name before, I apologize. Ryan, if you don't mind bringing up the Jamboard just so that we can show the questions that we'll be discussing now. Evan already went over them, but we have 2 Jamboard questions. One just asking, is the parking maximum language generally on the right track? So encourage you to create a sticky and provide your thoughts there. And there's a question on the second frame, and you have to use that little arrow at the top to get to it, asking about the approach to parking management in the metro area. So encourage you to put your ideas and thoughts there. And we'll go ahead and stop sharing screen and see if there are any clarifying questions or comments or thoughts on those couple of questions.
I got it all right. I see some hands. I did want to thank Jonathan. Jonathan assisted, participated in the work group and did additional thoughts on parking maximums. So
amazing, great. All right.
Okay.
Jonathan, go ahead.
All right. Again, Jonathan Harker with OAPA. And I did appreciate a lot of the attention that was paid in terms of looking at maximums and such. I had the chance to download about a dozen of the city parking codes that were mentioned in the presentations as ones where reform is done. And they all had in some form maximums, especially in the what we call climate friendly areas. My only comment then is I think they're all on the right track. I do wonder why we're not requiring maximums in all climate friendly areas. Instead, it's only being required, as I read the rules, only in those cities with populations over 100,000 or over 25,000 within metro. It just seems like maximum should be applied wherever there's a climate friendly area. That seems just to be the experience of cities throughout this country of that's what seems to be necessary to do to make sure that we don't overbuild parking. So I just wanted to make that comment. And again, thanks for the work that's been done on the parking part.
yeah, thanks for your help with it, Jonathan. It's an interesting comment. We certainly, because the rules as drafted, ask cities to do some work and set their own parking maximums. That's a work task that we don't want to burden all cities with, but we can consider where that line is, whether it should apply to smaller population cities as well. But yeah, that's why we did it. But I certainly understand that might relook at that question.
Thanks, Evan. Damien, over to you.
Thank you. I just had a follow-up clarifying question. So are there any other parking reform rules other than those shown in 435 that would apply to climate friendly areas? And what I'm asking is there something cross-referenced in the 300s I should be looking at as well as we go forward regarding climate friendly areas?
Sorry, yeah, I feel like the two areas cross-reference each other, but like the climate-friendly areas provisions say you have to comply with the 435s. The one thing I would note is that a lot of climate-friendly areas will probably overlap with the geographic transit corridors, and so it may just be that the transit corridor provisions are those that encompass all of the CFA, and then you're done. So yeah, there's kind of two different areas that the data are pretty clear, have lower parking demand, and so a lot of those are the same area in the Venn diagram. So
okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Jana?
Thank you. And I apologize for my confusion on this, parking in commercial spaces in climate friendly areas. And I'm curious for a couple of things. One is, of course, the ability for freight to deliver in those spaces and to have places to load and offload. And the second is for those trucking companies that are located in areas that may be where some of that land becomes part of a climate friendly area. They have large parking lots, of course, because that is this facility to store their assets as they're in and out. And so I don't want to preclude the ability for that to happen for those companies to be able to be located there and to be able to park their equipment and maintain it, et cetera. So I'm just curious about that.
Yeah, thank you, Jenna. The parking, as drafted, the parking maximums have to apply in CFAs and along transit corridors. So if you want to submit a specific exemption for it, the one exemption that's in there, well, there are exemptions. There are various exemptions. One is about automobile sales and repair, eating and drinking establishments, in entertainment and commercial recreational uses. So maybe we add something in there about storage of semis. I'm happy to have your language suggestion on that.
Well, you're going to have the same issue with transit in terms of bus where you park your buses, so to speak. So all of those issues are not unique to the commercial side. Yeah.
Okay. Appreciate that.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Jana.
And Evan, if I could jump in, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Just on the loading issue, and Evan, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think there's anything in the parking standards that would preclude a local government from adopting requirements for loading zones in conjunction with commercial or industrial development. Those would be separate from a parking standard, I believe.
Yeah, certainly, and there's very little in besides the parking maximum section that prohibits people from providing parking. So, yeah.
We don't want to discourage that, Kevin, because particularly as more and more product moves in and out of these urban areas, we want to be able to have a place to stop and load that's safe. Thank you.
Yep.
Thanks. And Julie?
So a couple of things. I guess first I wanted to add on to what Jana was just saying. I hadn't thought about that, and a half a mile is a pretty big distance. And just to put forth an example, in Salem, I'm pretty sure, without going and double checking, that Portland Road is a high frequency transit corridor. And I see Bill Holmstrom shaking his head, maybe not. It's not 15 minutes, but anyway, if it was, then that's a corridor that has a lot of heavy industrial, cold storage, stuff like that on it. So anyway, a good point. But my actual question was about section 450, which applies to cities with populations over 100,000. And I just want to confirm that I'm reading that correctly, that for cities over 100,000, we do not have 3 options to choose from. We only have 2 options to choose from. Is that correct?
Everything 425 through 450 is the remainder of the 2 options. So if you choose option 1, you're opted out of everything else. And so,
but I guess what it says in 450 is that if you're over 100,000, you can either choose option 1 and not, or you have to do the pricing, the percentage pricing. So I guess we were interpreting that to mean that we didn't have that other option, the middle option.
Yeah. So sorry, because this is unique to the 3 cities, Eugene, Salem, and Portland. And so so we've got that 3 option path that most cities have, and then we have this other two option thing. So that they're separate things. Cities that choose one of the last 2 options Eugene City, Eugene, Salem, or Portland, still have to choose one of the last two things. Oh, one of those two options. So you have to choose. You have to make both choices. So yes, you would have to either go the no mandates option, or you would have to add in the on-street pricing provision under one of your other two approaches. If that's clear as mud.
Yeah, it's not very clear. But
yeah, let me follow up with you outside this meeting to clarify. I'm sorry that I'm not doing a great job with my finger diagram.
No, I get it. It's just that we were going to have a meeting with some internal people, and our understanding was now we only have these two options, and so I wanted to make sure that was correct. But yes, please follow up with me.
Yeah, I'll send you an email, and then we can call if my email is less clear than my fingers. Okay.
Thank you. And Rob, over to you.
Yeah, again, Rob Interfeld with City of Eugene. And Damien may have asked about this earlier, and I had to put my attention to something else for a minute, so I apologize if I'm asking something he already asked. But one of the things that's important to the City of Eugene is that we have to follow state rules around having clear and objective standards when reviewing and approving housing. And there's some places in the rules that are not consistent with that requirement. So I really want to encourage you to go back through and make sure that the rules are consistent. And one example applies to parking maximums, where it says along priority transit corridors, that it doesn't really clear about what does along mean. Does it mean right the property fronting on the corridor? Does it mean within a quarter mile of the corridor? There was also an example within the EV charging where it said the installation of sufficient dedicated electrical service capacity. Again, that's not clear and objective. So really want to encourage you to, and I think for the transit corridors, we would definitely be interested in weighing in on what does along mean, but I think that, but that's another conversation. So I'm not going to weigh in on that now. Thanks.
Thanks, Rob. And certainly our council will hopefully flag those issues for us as well as they're going through. And because some of this newer language hasn't been chewed through the system a few times, there are some loose strands there. The along transit corridors was with the cross-reference over to the transit corridor provision was meant to include the same land area as, but I understand that the word along is not as clear as it could be in that statement. So that was the intent. And if you think that intent is too large for parking maximums, too large of a corridor as Julie flagged, happy to get your feedback on that either now or offline. And yes, now I just want to name random roads in Oregon and get bus frequencies from Bill. Like that's my favorite. This is my favorite parlor game. Anyway, yeah, Southwest 3rd and Corvallis. Okay.
Thanks, Evan. Sounds like a very exciting game. So I just want to maybe look to the Jamboard for a second to bring in a few of those comments into the discussion, and then we can see if we move into the next topic for today. So just want to lift up, there have been a few comments here, a suggestion to include plugs for electric wheelchair users at EV charging stations, a desire for more flexibility to take interim steps towards parking regulations, and a question about the vacancy documentation program. And then also just noting that parking is an important part of reaching the rulemaking outcomes. So thanks folks for those comments, and continue to provide them if you would like. And Evan, anything else you want to kind of respond to or next steps before we move into the rule update on transportation system planning?
No, I think I would just respond to the EV wheelchair issue. Certainly I think we've tried to address that with the bike parking areas, that they would have charging stations for various electric devices, including EV wheelchairs, but which might be a more appropriate place for them to be charged rather than in an EV car parking space. But so certainly are aware that that's a demand and a need as part of the equity lens. So I appreciate that.
Thank you, Evan. All right, well, with that, let's go into our final look at a rules section for today, which is the Transportation System Planning Division. So I'm going to hand it over to Bill to provide a little bit of an overview, and then we'll get into discussion.
Yeah, thank you. I have a lot to go through, so I'm going to kind of go through it quickly. And hopefully people will be able to keep up. So I'm going to talk about the updated draft rules. There's a number of changes that we make. I'm going to just highlight some of them. I'm not going to capture every little change, obviously, that we've made, because there's a lot of different things that have happened. I will talk about, when I say next steps, I'm talking about I'm going to highlight some things I know we still need to maybe work on or that pay attention to that we've heard from people. And I want to highlight some of those things. And then, yeah, we'll have time for discussion. So, there we go. Okay. So in the past few months, like I said earlier, we've had many conversations with a lot of different people. We've held those 14 work groups and practitioner meetings. We had a voluminous amount of comments from the public and members of the advisory committee. And I think we've tried to take all of that and listen to that and take as much of that as we can into account in the updated rules. So getting into them, talking about timing and phasing, and we've already talked about some pieces of this, but one big piece that I want to highlight is that we're providing an option for local governments to propose a work program that would apply instead of the effective dates or deadlines that are in the rule. And this really gives, I think, local governments a lot more flexibility to react to the realities that are happening within their communities, and we've heard that over and over again. It also gives, frankly, the state an opportunity to, get its ducks in a row in terms of resources available to help support all these things. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit here. We've designed it so that they have to be coordinated regionally, that there's certain criteria that these work programs have to meet, including making sure that they're urgent. The work program can't say, we're going to do this all in 5 years. Some things have to happen quickly, and we expect everything to be done within a certain amount of time. The work program would include a program to update the transportation system plan. And the work program would then be approved by the commission, and the commission would have the ability to make tweaks to that work program along the way if necessary. Getting into rules around our pedestrian and bicycle system planning, we heard a number of things about this from, I think, a range of interests. We've tried to be clearer about the requirements in general. A lot of our rules really attach themselves to the functional classification of a street. That means like a local, an arterial, a collector street. Those are functional classifications. We've gotten rid of almost all of those references in these pieces to those functional classifications, and really talking about volume of traffic, the amount of traffic, and the speed of traffic, because that's really what's important in terms of making sure that it's comfortable for people who are walking, using a mobility device, using a bicycle, riding some other sort of micromobility device on these facilities. Is that the whole reason we're doing this plan is to protect them from motor vehicles, right? That's what makes them feel unsafe. And if it's a small, slow street with not very much traffic, you don't necessarily need to have the same level of facility or plan for the same level of facility that you would on a very busy, fast street. And so that's really what we're trying to get at with these rules. In terms of our bicycles section, we've made some significant changes, really trying to get at what is it that we're really trying to do here. We want a connected network of safe, low-stress facilities that is open to people of all ages and abilities, and that's really that's the key thing for making a bicycle network that works. We've received a number of comments asking us to go further, to specify, in particular, I'd say the NACTO requirements, and NACTO is the National Association of City Transportation Officials. That's a great organization. They have lots of great materials out there that talk about specific how cities, and this is, it's an organization of cities, how they implement good bicycle facilities in particular on city streets. Our guidance is absolutely going to be pointing to those resources. We didn't think it was appropriate for the rules to have that level of prescription in it for local governments. So, you know, and frankly, you know, 5 years things can change. If we are pointing to a stale version of NACDO guidance, that's not going to work very well. So we want the rules to be flexible enough to be able to change, but we're also trying to make sure that they're strong enough to direct local governments to be doing, to be planning for bicycle networks that really shift the number of people that are able and feel comfortable to ride bicycles. We've also clarified bicycle parking requirements. We received a kind of a variety of comments on that, and the packet talks a little bit more detail about what we've done there, but we've tried to clarify that to make sure that we're not you know, precluding putting bicycle parking in downtowns or things like that in places where I think people were making some interpretations there that weren't intended. So we fixed some of those things. We have a draft rule 830 that is designed to authorize. It's an extra process that we are adding to make sure that when local governments are interested in planning facilities that would increase vehicle capacity, motor vehicle capacity, that they're taking a look at that and really seeing, are there other ways to meet the need for doing this? Because a large part of what we're trying to do with this rulemaking is really bringing up those other modes of transportation, and, you know, kind of recognizing that we've done a very good job in the last half a century of building out the street network. Not to say that we don't need more investments in the street network. We're not saying don't do these things. We're just saying go through an extra process. So the draft rule, you know, it does require these facilities to be reviewed before they're added to a plan. We've made some changes to this based on feedback we've heard. There are a number of facilities that we heard from people like, hey, do you really want this thing to go through a whole review process? Is that necessary? Maybe not. We've added a whole list of things that we believe could be excluded or exempted from going through this review, and they're usually pretty small scale things. We've also clarified kind of how the review works and the level of detail that we expect, and that it's planning level. It's, you know, ahead of being something in the plan. People were, you know, coming at us asking, like, will we need like a NEPA level of analysis? Will we need to do, you know, all sorts of engineering stuff? Like, that's not what we're talking about here. This is about getting a project into a plan. So it's planning level and uses the mentioned existing data and existing information in your existing plans as you can. And then the other piece of it is we do require a public engagement piece to this, and we've clarified that can be coordinated with other projects, or, you know, an update of a transportation system plan. It doesn't have to be a separate thing. So I did want to mention that. When it comes to land use, we did make a few changes. Our draft rules 330, which talks about land use requirements across the urban area that have to do with the transportation system, making sure that's coordinated. And 340, which talks about assumptions local governments need to make about land use when they're making transportation planning decisions. I think we were very unclear before about when these changes needed to happen. We I think clarified to say you make these land use changes, these updates at the time you do your transportation system plan update. And in general, we've kind of tried to line up more of our dates along with transportation system plan updates. We heard a lot from folks that we had some requirements in there that were maybe too detailed, too prescriptive, in particular around neighborhoods and how they're designed. We've cut back on some of those kind of the detail on that and the prescriptiveness, but we are asking local governments to take a look at those requirements every time they update a transportation system plan and make sure that they're in line with the goals that we're trying to achieve here, that the transportation system plan is trying to achieve. Because I think sometimes these things get put into a land use code and they just kind of stay there. So we're asking for that kind of continual review. We've clarified some requirements around auto-related land uses, which will, they continue to be allowed, of course, under our rules. It's just a matter of making sure that those land uses are going to be, not preventing a pedestrian-friendly environment in our communities. That's mainly what those requirements are about. When it comes to land use assumptions, We did say before in the draft rules that they need to include both jobs and housing, but I think we wanted to people hadn't heard necessarily that employment piece, so we pulled that up a little bit and clear that the assumptions for when you're doing your transportation system plan, you need to determine where you expect housing to go and where you expect employment to go. This is not something necessarily new. Local governments do this all the time when they're updating plans, so we're just laying out that expectation clearly in the rules. And then also the frequency of when these assumptions are updated. We heard some concern that maybe if the assumptions weren't updated at the time we did climate-friendly area updates, that we'd be doing some planning that wouldn't be lined up to that. So we're being clear. Every time you do your transportation system plan, you need to make sure that this is up to date. But also at the time you're updating the climate-friendly areas or designating those climate-friendly areas, you also need to make sure that those land use assumptions are consistent with the climate-friendly areas that you've adopted. When it comes to project lists, we had we have two main project list types in the transportation system plan. One we used to call illustrative. We heard that was a confusing name, so we've changed it to unconstrained. That's a big long list of projects that are needed to meet gaps in the transportation system. Doesn't mean that you're going to be able to pay for all of them. That's a big long list of all the needs, and frankly the needs we know outstrip the available resources. So that's why we also have a financially constrained list, which talks about what are the projects that are at the top of that list that we believe we'll be able to pay for over the life of the transportation system plan. When you prioritize that unconstrained list in advance of trying to put those top projects into the financially constrained list, we heard from people there's a lot of projects in some cities on that list. It's too hard to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We're allowing prioritization in tiers. You can say this is the top 10%, the next 10%, something like that, where you're saying we still have prioritization. We still know what our top projects are, but we didn't go down to that level of detail of every single little project. This sidewalk infill project, something like that, is just it's a level of detail that's just not necessary. So we do allow that. We heard from one jurisdiction in particular that they were concerned about existing bond-funded projects that could potentially be fall under that line to go into the financially constrained list, and then they wouldn't be able to build them. So we added that as a prioritization factor, that if you have existing bond funding that existed as of the date in the rule is January 1st of this year. So if you already have a bond that exists already, not in the future, that you will be able to use that as a prioritization factor to say, yes, it should be higher priority and should be in the financially constrained list because we've got money for doing it, and we promised that we would do that project in the bond. And then one other thing we heard, there was a big concern from local governments, was around development funded projects. You can't necessarily anticipate where all the developments are going to happen in the future or over the life of the plan, and you may have projects that are in the unconstrained list that didn't quite get as far up as into the highest ranks that would be financially constrained. That then developer comes along and says, well, I would like to, this project makes sense, it's right next to my development, I need to build the sidewalk here, things like that. Would they be prevented from doing that project because it's not in the financially constrained list? We said no. If that's along with development, it's on the unconstrained list, and it's not a project that had to be authorized through Rule 830, you can do that project. That would be allowed. So I just want to be clear about that. Other changes. So these are kind of changes throughout. We made a number of changes to support accessibility. We received Michael. We worked with Michael closely generously to provide some input to us on accessibility. I'm not sure we've got everything nailed down as much as we want to yet, but we did make a number of changes throughout the rules on that. As you'll see in your packet, we did move and renumber some rules. Some got renamed as well, but mostly renumbered, but hopefully mostly settled at this point. And then, various other small things. I couldn't cover everything based on suggestions and questions. Next steps, what we're going to be doing in the next few months here. We're continue to refine these rules ahead of and in response to the legal review I talked about earlier that's happening in February. Places in particular where I think we're going to need to pay a little bit more attention, where we aren't quite there yet, are around project lists, regional planning, like Cody was talking about earlier. We've heard some concerns about how those work together with the local planning, and then the role of vehicle miles traveled. And those all kind of work together and interact in interesting ways. And we want to make sure we've got that nailed down and right first before we move too much further. So I think we still have a little bit of finessing to do there. Projects that require authorization, Rule 830, like I said, we had a number of projects that types of projects that we have exempted from going through that. We've heard concerns that maybe we need to add a few more things. I think in particular, turn lanes is one thing that I think people are concerned about. I think we want sideboards on that to make sure that we're not going overboard, but because we want to be able to protect, pedestrian access across streets and things like that, and that we're not, having those impacts as well. There's trade-offs. So I think we're going to take a close look at that, at maybe making some more tweaks to that. And then, the timing of transportation system plan updates, we're going to be talking with our commission about this in a couple of weeks, making sure that we've got that correct. But that lines up also a lot with the resources available, which leads me to my next slide. Is we know that a lot of the work we have to do isn't have to do with what's in the rules at all. It's what happens afterward, and starting now, is that we need to be able to provide guidance, technical support, and funding to do updates directly to communities. So this is something I think the state takes seriously, and we're working really hard to behind the scenes to try to make sure this works. We're working with ODOT to identify and deploy additional funding. We have we've previously identified, I don't know the exact number off the top of my head, some millions of dollars to support the regional planning efforts, the regional scenario planning efforts. That's still there. We have $768,000 that's to DLCD from the legislature this last session to provide support to local governments. Primarily, we're going to use that for climate-friendly areas to help stand those up, but we're still working on the details of that, and there may be some other little pieces that we'll work on as well. And then later on today, like Chair MacArthur said, there's a meeting of the Oregon Transportation Commission. The number in their staff report is $15 million to local governments to help update transportation system plans. That's not written in stone yet. My understanding is that we're going to be looking for maybe a little bit more. We'll see, but that's the number that's in the staff report for the Transportation Commission right now. And that would mainly be aimed at local transportation system plans, although I think we still need to talk about exactly what the right needs are. I think, we've heard a lot about inventories, pedestrian and bicycle in particular, and are there things the state can do to help support local governments in developing those inventories and making sure there's a consistent standard for doing that. I think that might be a piece of that. But that's still all things that we're talking about. So yeah, I think we're ready to have a discussion. I see there's a number of hands that have come up already. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Bill. Appreciate that. So we'll have a discussion and have a Jamboard up as well. So Ryan, if you don't mind just sharing the Jamboard to see the questions, and Bianca will put the link in the chat here. So we just want to ask folks if you think these draft rules work to meet the objectives of rulemaking. So that's on one frame. And then if you click on the arrow at the top, you'll see a second question on, do you think the updated draft rules work to meet what one part of the draft rules do you think we need to pay close attention to? So we'd appreciate any comments in the Jamboard or through the discussion. And yeah, see a number of hands up, so we can take the Jamboard down. And let's go to Leanne and then Emma.
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to just express, one, I appreciate the incorporation of the all ages and abilities language into the rules for bike ped infrastructure. One of the concerns, and also kind of that kind of integrating volume and speed. One of the concerns I have is that if we don't have some at least floor for what that means, that it's going to be applied really inconsistently. Like I know that currently the City of Bend is going through looking at our kind of standards, updating our standards and specifications, right? That will be in our code for kind of that minimum piece. And I know that city staff is developing a separate complete streets guide, which may have more progressive guidance, but under what we're seeing, you know, for that bare minimum is that potentially, if I'm reading it correctly, we could have, you know, minor collectors with, you know, speeds of up to 40 miles per hour that have buffered bike lanes. And that doesn't meet the all ages and ability standard, but, you know, here we have it, which, you know, in our local code may eventually say that this is okay. So I'm trying to figure out, you know, what, is there a way to at least create some rails that everyone can have some consensus on, and then provide these other tools like NACDO that are really what I consider to be best practice, and as they get maybe more and more progressive and better. But that's just one concern I have around that, because just for that, making sure that we have really high quality facilities. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. And that's certainly something that that we've struggled with. I've struggled with a lot in terms of the balance of, you know, where the rules, where they sit, and the level of specificity that we want to provide, and make sure that there's a floor there. It's tough to strike that balance. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. And Emma?
Thank you. Emma Newman with the City of Springfield. I have two questions and then a few comments to share. My first, Bill, I think when you started introducing this topic, you said that with the work programs that we'd have 5 years to complete all the components. I'm looking at 0012 section 3C, and I'm seeing June 30th of 2025, which would be 3 years. Can you just clarify what the deadline is for that item, please?
I think what I said is you can't start something 5 years from now. I think is the thing I said at the beginning. I was just as an example, but the date that's in the draft rule is the date that's in there. Is that subject to change and negotiation? It is, and also, you know, I want to be clear that we've put in requirements for local governments for what they can propose, but we've given the commission absolute flexibility in what they can actually require in the work program. So if the commission said, geez, it's taking you guys a long time and it makes sense, then they can push it out, and we're not restricting that in any way.
Great. I appreciate the work programs and the ability for local jurisdictions to get started, but also recognize we're working in reality, which it's ever evolving. My next question is, I'm wondering whether the issue around transportation planning and transportation project development being two separate, distinct pieces to reflect the existing TPR, whether that's been resolved or not.
Yeah, that's one of the things I didn't throw in my slides. So there's an existing rule. It's Rule 50 that talks about transportation project development, and frankly, we should have included that as part of the rules that continue to apply statewide, and there was an oversight that we didn't, and it is now, we've changed that Rule 11 to say that continues to apply everywhere. So Rule 50, which talks about transportation project development today and has for decades, will continue to apply inside and outside of metropolitan areas. So that we did make that change, but it's a change in our draft, but it doesn't really change the way it works for local governments today.
Okay, yeah, that's really important to keep that existing piece in place so that we're not going in circles. So a few comments. I really appreciate the tiers that are introduced for the project list. I think that's a lot clearer and provides more flexibility. So thanks for being responsive in that section, 0170, section 4. With 182A, I worry that that is not actually legally defensible. I do not believe that LCDC has the authority to limit what is in the federally required RTP. So I would suggest revisions to 182A. 182B, on the other hand, I really appreciate that change that allows cities to require developers to build projects on the unconstrained project list as part of development. That's a key way that some of our sidewalks and bike facilities are actually getting built in our cities when there isn't public funding, but private developments helping partner on those. And then the revisions to the street and highway system planning. So in section 831D, I really appreciate that that section had some revisions that allows like a roundabout to be built without having to go through an additional very intensive work process and analysis. I worry about the $500,000, the 500,000 not being tied to inflation. I appreciate that clause of trying to have small scale projects that can get done more efficiently and quickly. But I think that dollar amount is soon going to be out of date given just the cost increases we've seen in the last year or two. So perhaps tying it to inflation or having it set at least $1 million to start. Some additional work in that section would be fantastic.
Thank you. And just to your first point about 182A, and that just real quick, that we'll talk with our council about that just to make sure. But the way I tried to write that was that it's a restriction on the local government to advance projects to the RTP. But we'll check and see if we can do that. I think we can, but we'll double check that. Thank you.
Thank you. And Margie?
Thank you. I'm curious about the term regional coordinated work plans. They're referenced a couple of times, and I think the idea, and of course, Metro supports the concept of having regional coordinated work plans on TSPs and a few of these other items. I'm curious in terms of what you envision in terms of the actual coordination, like using existing committees or creating new committees, and then also your thoughts on kind of the level of specificity.
Yeah, I think the answer is different in the Portland metropolitan area than it would be in the other 7 metropolitan areas, and frankly, we were probably thinking about the other places when we were writing this rule about you guys have to work together to have a coordinated work program. And when I say coordinated work program, I mean, I'll say Eugene Springfield, for example, here. Eugene has, certain things that they want to do at certain times, and Springfield has certain things. They just need to make sure that they don't totally conflict with each other, but they'll each just have their own separate work program that they'll send forward. They'll just work together. In the Portland metro area, I think we were thinking that Metro, because we allow Metro to submit a work program, that they would submit a coordinated work program, but that would be for everything. But I can see that there might be local governments that might also want to submit. So I think maybe we have some more thinking to do around that particular piece of it. And then we're happy to sit down with, I think, Metro and local governments in Metro to see how that would work out.
And Bill, I think Margie might have frozen and gotten disconnected, so may need to chat with her offline.
Well, definitely have to talk with her some other time then. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you. Damien and then Rob.
All right, thank you. So first, I wanted to say thank you for adding 10 to 0012 regarding voter approved bonds. That was a huge relief. Thank you very much for adding that in. I have a question regarding the work program language under 3BB and 3BC. Am I reading it correctly that with a work program, could a city say, there are certain amounts we think we can get done according to the deadlines and the rules. Here are the other ones that we're going to request some more time to finish?
Yeah, we're trying to give local governments flexibility to say, we want the work program just for this piece of it, right? We don't necessarily need the work program for everything. Like we just, we know we can do the CFAs on time, but we just need this other stuff. We need different dates. So that's what that's trying to do. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you. And Rob?
Yeah, again, Rob Interfeld with the City of Eugene. So I have a couple of questions. So with the work program, is the idea that we could submit our own work program for the elements that are just City of Eugene's, but then a coordinated one for any things that require coordination? Is that the idea, Bill?
I think that's right, yeah.
Okay. And then I just can't tell from reading through the rules. So I just want to ask you, are cities going to still be required to have regional TSPs within MPO areas or not?
not outside of the Portland metropolitan area. There's the regional transportation system plan that it's in the existing transportation planning rules. That concept is no longer part of the rules.
Thank you. So there seems like there's some regional TSP for counties. Can you explain what that is? I can't quite understand from reading it.
It's confusing. So the existing transportation planning rules require a thing called regional transportation system plans in metropolitan areas, but it also requires every county in the state, all 36 of them, to also do a regional transportation system plan. It has probably completely different function really than what we've been thinking about in metropolitan areas. It's really just about, it's a county TSP. It's how counties plan for region connectivity within the county, between local communities and into other counties. It's and that's how the rule is written right now. I've tried to as little as possible affect jurisdictions outside of metropolitan areas with our rulemaking. So, and we've told folks outside of metropolitan areas, we're not messing with you guys. So that's why that's staying that way. It doesn't really make sense, but like, that's why we're doing it that way.
Okay, thank you, I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Rob. And Julie, before we get to your hand, I just want to point to the Jamboard for just a moment here. Ryan, if you don't mind sharing that. A few comments are coming up that I just want to bring into the conversation. So we're seeing some comments about a desire for really those hard deadlines for TSP updates. Also just advocating that the rules should really be helping to stop some highway expansion, especially some of the Rose Quarter and Interstate Bridge expansions. For transit planning, wanting stronger rules and coordination for cities that are smaller, a desire to strengthen the transportation options section, a suggestion to inventory car share, parking cash out, and mobility wallets. Also a comment for bike facilities to have separate or buffered facilities when there are speeds of 25 miles per hour or higher, and other comments too, but just want to kind of lift up some of those that are coming out here. So thanks, folks, for continuing to provide your ideas there. And if anyone wants to expand on any of that in the conversation, please do so. Julie, want to go over to you?
Hi, Julie Warnicki, Transportation Planning Manager, City of Salem. I have a few things. I just want to, I guess, second a number of the things that Emma said regarding the connection to the regional transportation plans, the $500,000 being indexed to inflation. There was probably something else, but a couple of specific questions. One, on the capacity increasing exceptions, I know you said that there was still maybe some more work to be done. To me, that work needs to focus around safety and how do we define safety and go from there. On the work program that you were just talking about, I guess it's section 12(3)(a). I was surprised to hear you say that would include a timeline for the updating a transportation system plan, because it says that you have to do a work program and it would then take the place of other deadlines in the rule, but there is no deadline for the transportation system plan other than its division 44 related to the scenario planning, which is after the date that you're saying this work program would have to have everything done. So, because this work program thing says everything has to be done by June 30th of 2025, I believe. Whereas under, at least for Salem, the implementation of the scenario plan with the TSP updates is somewhere in 2026. Anyway, they don't really line up. I also think that if the TSP was part of that 2025 June is very soon, especially if we're doing the scenario plan. If we're not doing it, then maybe not. So on the issue with the voter approved bonds, I guess I'm a little bothered with the date being set retroactively a year ago, because at least for the city of Salem, we are currently doing public outreach for a potential likely bond measure to go to the voters this fall. And so, you know, having that not be excluded means that it's sort of asking the city to presuppose some project priorities that we haven't developed, haven't done any outreach on, as we develop the bond measure, as opposed to relying on our already adopted acknowledged transportation plan. So that bothers me a little bit, especially given our timing right now. You know, that said, I mean, I think that most of the things we'll likely put on a bond would likely already, you know, fall into the higher priority. It just bothers me that it's, you know, making us assume something that we haven't done yet. The sort of a general thing, and this ties in with that 182A section where it says you could only advance projects from your financially constrained plan into the RTP. It makes me think that there's it seems to be there's a little bit of a disconnect between the level of detail that we have at a transportation system planning level versus what a project might be when we go for funding. So like, for example, with, you know, safe routes to school, just use that as an example. We, you know, last time when we applied for projects, we applied for a couple of pedestrian crossing enhancements. We applied for a sidewalk infill. You know, none of those are listed specifically as projects in our TSP because they're at that sort of small level where they're consistent with our TSP, but they're not listed as a project. And so there seems to be a little bit of a disconnect between what is a project identified in your plan versus what's consistent with. And you know, whether that the requirement related to the regional transportation plans goes forward or not, I think there needs to be a recognition of that level of detail. I mean, I think, Bill, you're familiar in the Salem Bike Ped plan, we identified intersections that have issues. We haven't identified necessarily what the solutions are for bike ped at those intersections. Is the project in the plan? We don't have a cost with it, you know. So anyway, I'll get off of my list.
Thank you, Julie. Oh, go ahead, Bill.
No, I was just saying thank you. I think there's a couple pieces there where we know we have a little bit of work to do for sure. Yeah.
Thank you. Emma, let's go to you, and then I think we can take a break before moving into the next section of today's agenda.
Thank you. Emma Nemo with Springfield again. Julie asked some questions around the bond approved projects that I was wondering. So I wanted to clarify, would bond funded projects that are purely preservation of the existing transportation system and would include ADA ramp upgrades, I will note, but are not building out like new TSP projects, would those be okay to move forward in the coming years? Say that Springfield passes another bond measure. Are we good to go, or is this putting a damper on that?
No, just to be clear, you know, preservation, maintenance, operational changes, you know, ADA, things like that, those are really outside the scope of the TSP, the planned projects. You know, those you don't even need to worry about those. Those are all kind of the maintenance level stuff is under that level and whatnot piece of it. Just to be clear about the bond funding piece of it, it's really, I mean, Damien said it was the City of Bend that had that concern about, they had just approved a bond and had a bunch of projects on it, and they're like, well, what if we can't do some of the projects that are on it because of the way you've set this up? And that was why we set the date we set, is because we're trying to take that the concern of an existing bond that already had been approved. But I hear Julie's concern too, and we can think about that a little bit more about the next couple of years where we have existing acknowledged TSPs that don't yet meet the new standards, and that kind of gap that we're going to have the next few years here. We can think about that.
Great, thank you. All right, well, let's go ahead and take a break, and we'll get back together at 12:05 here to review the fiscal, housing, and racial equity impact statements as our next topic. So go ahead and take a break, turn off video, and put yourself on mute if you'd like, and we'll see you at 12:05. All right, welcome back, folks. We've just got a couple more topics for the agenda today, and we're going to move into a review of the fiscal impact statement and housing impact statement and racial equity impact statement for the rules. So I'll turn it over to Kevin on this.
Thank you, Sylvia. And thank you, Bill, for bringing up the PowerPoint. We can go ahead and advance to the next slide. All right, so one of the required things that we need to do when we amend administrative rules is to publish impact statements that anticipate impacts that may occur based on the rule, the draft of the rules that we're moving forward. And this particular effort is subject to 3 requirements of a fiscal impact statement, a housing impact statement, and a racial equity impact statement. I'll speak to all 3 of those in detail. They're all required by law. The racial equity impact statement is the most recent requirement that actually came into play just with the last legislative session. There was a bill that was passed to establish those requirements. Next slide, please. And actually, before I go into detail, I do want to apologize in that the we recognize the supplemental packets containing these impact statements came to you relatively recently. The reason is, it took us a while to get our consultant on board. They actually had to do some pretty quick work over the holidays to get this done timely. And also acknowledging that we had just issued a new draft of the rules, there were some adjustments that needed to be made to sort of acknowledge the most recent rule set. So the question that we'll be framing for the RAC today is basically what I will do is kind of outline what the rules require in terms of the impact statements. Hopefully you've had some chance to review those impact statements. I'm not going to go through them in detail, but I will kind of summarize the findings and get some input back from you as to whether we've accomplished that purpose. So the first requirement is for the fiscal impact statement. And as a part of this work, we're required to identify any persons this proposed rule could affect. That includes small and large businesses, state agencies, ourselves and other agencies, local governments, and the public. In determining that economic impact, the agency is to project any significant economic effect of that action on businesses, which shall include a cost of compliance effect on small businesses affected. The rules also specifically state where DLCD or the agencies are not required to conduct original research in creating the fiscal impact statement. And so the draft that you've been provided does provide quite a lot of discussion of impacts to small and large businesses, local governments, state agencies, the general public. It looks at changes to Division 8, so that's the housing rule, changes to the transportation planning rule, and changes to the greenhouse gas reduction rule altogether. In conclusion, that analysis finds that compliance costs, both monetary and time related for local governments, to amend local development regulations for consistency with draft rules, and for DLC to review those amendments. So those costs will be additional costs we recognize for local governments and for our agency. As you know, we do have some funding to support some of the work, and we are definitely pursuing additional funding to support local governments, as well as our own agency work in reviewing those amendments. Another finding is that potential increased costs and a reduction in the efficiency of transportation systems for some users as additional performance criteria are introduced into the transportation system assessment. That is a potential impact. Additionally, for other users, the transportation system efficiency may be improved. That could be based on mode usage. But essentially, those are the conclusions. There's a whole lot more discussion in the fiscal impact statement. itself. And what I'll do is just kind of broadly go through each of these, and then we'll have some time for discussion and input on each of these. So the next slide speaks to the housing impact statement, and this is a really kind of a unique animal. As you can see from the slide, so I'm scrolling towards that section of the analysis. This required impact statement requires an estimate of the effect of a proposed rule or ordinance on the cost of development of a 6,000 square foot parcel and the construction of a 1,200 square foot detached single family dwelling on that parcel. Very, very precise kind of consideration. Our question to you, of course, does the impact statement meet this requirement? And I will note, as I think has been alluded to already today, frankly, the minimum density requirements that we're looking at for climate-friendly areas in particular would preclude this type of development in a climate-friendly area. Generally, a 6,000 square foot single-family home is going to generate on a per acre basis, 7 units per acre at best. And so, based in part on that recognition, and we've already talked about how climate-friendly areas will be done in a certain way, but the other residential needs will be planned for, outside of climate-friendly areas. The conclusion from this analysis was that the rules would be expected to have a negligible impact on home pricing for a 1,200 square foot home on a 6,000 square foot lot. Also, the inclusion of the housing production strategy process should allow for larger jurisdictions to calibrate their policies and programs to mitigate against escalatory pricing impacts on housing. Yeah, the housing production strategy tool is kind of a relatively new and ongoing process, and it will allow local governments to kind of look at the impacts of policies on housing and make adjustments over time. And then lastly, next slide, please. The racial equity impact statement came about with passage of House Bill 2993 in this past year. And this requires agencies to include a statement identifying how adoption of the rule will affect racial equity in the state. This is kind of a brand new requirement. We've consulted with the Department of Justice and others to figure out how to do this impact statement work. And to be perfectly honest, this is one of the first ones that I think will be done in the state. So it's a this will be a work in progress, but we've done our best to kind of overall look at the rules and figure out what we think the ultimate result will be. Our question to you again, does the impact statement meet this requirement? The conclusion from the analysis, and basically the language from the current impact statement says the clear intent of the rule changes is to promote racial equity and equitable outcomes. Additional outreach, changes in prioritization, and specific equity study requirements are supportive of those goals. Many of the new rules to address racial equity will extend planning periods and increase costs significantly, which may negatively impact underserved populations by delaying new transportation investments and/or reducing the available investment amounts. Impacts on mobility can be regressive as transportation costs represent a higher percentage of overall expenditures for lower income households. The new rules place a greater emphasis on alternative modes of transportation, but those are not always available or practical in many communities. While there may be some level of unintended consequences, we expect that the rules will further racial equity objectives. Over time, the monitoring process outlined in the new rules should allow for recalibration of the rules if significant negative outcomes are identified. So in a nutshell, that is the analysis that's been provided, and I would welcome any comments or observations, input on those equity statements.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin. So welcome any thoughts or reflections on that. And I think as Kevin noted, you all may need a little bit more time to review the impact statements in your packets and provide some input after the meeting, but just any reflections or thoughts on whether these statements seem accurate or if there's anything missing here. And I see a hand up from Samantha.
Sure. So Samantha Bear, Housing Program Director for the Oregon Home Builders Association. A couple notes on the equity statement. I think we've talked a lot already about possible equity impacts from lack of home ownership opportunities within CFAs and then the preclusion of single family units. A lot of that is discussed in the report on addressing barriers to home ownership for people of color in Oregon that came out in 2019 from the Joint Task Force. And I would really encourage the department to review that document and add a lot of that analysis into the equity statement. A couple points is just what happens when we prohibit or limit home ownership opportunities in our metro areas, particularly for buyers of color who want to buy homes and increase multi-generational wealth opportunities. Secondly, on precluding single family development, sorry, my fiance just walked in the background. We know that there is a demand for homes that are big enough for multi-generational households. And we know that single family units are preferred, especially as they can be places of worship and can provide other cultural benefits. And I think as we look at designing our CFAs and what we want those to look like, I think we want to afford those places for people. And so I'll put the report in the chat, but I think there's quite a bit that could be added into the equity statement from that report.
Thanks, Samantha. Any thoughts, Kevin?
Just a thank you. Yeah.
Thanks. And Matt?
Yeah, thanks. Matt Brinkley, Planning Director, City of Medford. I think it's interesting that the unit of measurement for the housing impact statement is a single family home, which isn't really anything that we're looking at in the CFAs. I would note, kind of as I alluded to earlier in the discussion about block length, that it is multifamily housing that is the single residential building type which is going to bear the costs of this rule. So whether it's requirements for parking lots or whatever it is, it's multifamily housing that bears those costs. Single family housing does not. And I think that that's something that should be considered. I understand that the statute requires that unit of measurement to be a 1,200 square foot single family home, but it's at the very least ironic and something that I think is worth noting, that multifamily housing that we are trying to encourage the development of is going to bear the costs of this rule and not single family housing.
Thanks, Matt. And Leanne?
Hi, thanks. I guess this is an observation, and I don't know how this would necessarily integrate into the racial equity impact statement. But when I'm thinking about even the process for this RAC and how this is pretty wonky stuff. The institutional voices have really dominated this conversation. And we even saw this process slow down and have a lot of additional meetings because of reactions from city staff around the state who have always historically and currently had a loud voice in this process. And so I didn't actually, because it came out so late, have a chance to take a look at it, but just recognizing that this RAC was convened, people were invited to the table who had traditionally not been invited to the table before. And that when we're looking at, those equity impacts in this context, that we should really be kind of honest about this process and who's been driving it, and finding that balance and making sure that that is kind of incorporated into this piece, because we can't say that we centered equity in this RAC if we're not actually centering the voices that were invited that hadn't had a voice before. Thank you.
Yeah, and Kirsten. And I think you're on mute.
Sorry, guys, I have to be on two machines here because two pieces of equipment here because of internet going in and out. But Leanne, thank you. We take that super seriously. We did invite the range of voices to the table and are deeply appreciative. And I would also, not to disagree with anything you've said, mostly just to also point out though that the impact of the racial equity lens that this RAC developed in its first 4 and I think 5 meetings is unprecedented in the state from anything I've seen. Granted, I have a limited view, but I hope that everyone feels extremely proud of that work and attended to the summary memo and the RAC 10 packet of how the rules pull those outcomes to and through the rules. And I would focus as folks tend back on that too, as well as this sort of 2-pager on racial equity impacts doesn't quite do it justice. All respect to Jerry Johnson. He doesn't have the background or the depth or didn't participate in those 5 meetings. He's sort of has in all the subsequent meetings, so he has sort of a limited view. Kevin's right. This is very new guidance on the racial impact analysis. Staff are still, we've received it over the weekend and sent it out to the RAC. So staff ourselves are still kind of studying it and diagramming it and expect to be making some revisions. But to your bigger point of voices, I'll just say something really quickly here that I was going to say at wrap up. But one of the things, and it's not to say that it wasn't an issue in this process. So Leanne, we're really, we do look forward to debrief sessions on this, on how this process went, how it could be better, different as we go forward. The one thing we will be doing is having 3 touch points in developing the budget requests for how to implement this program. So interviewing members, Kearns and Weston DLCD staff will be interviewing members of this RAC who identified as having experience with equitable outcomes in their application to see how this work went for them and what they would need in the future to help implement the rules. So that's one touch point. Another touch point would be a come one, come all RAC focused kind of equity reflection and look forward forum that'd be coming between the 2 hearings, probably in when's our first hearing, March 31st. So probably sometime in the March timeframe, possibly before the first hearing. And then the final being a survey of local governments, to use your term, and it's a powerful one, kind of the institutional voices, but the local governments that do need to implement the rules, we do want to hear again what they need to implement as we're building that budget request packet. So none of that's to say anything you said was wrong, Leanne, but I just wanted to sort of provide the breadth of ways we still want to continue to hear from people on these issues. It's critically important, as you say, if we're serious about centering equity, we cannot lose sight of those goals, and also hearing voices. So open to other thoughts as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Kirsten. And Michael, I saw you go off mute. Did you have a thought on that before we go to Jay Raj? I know you have to leave at 12:30, so just respecting that.
Just very quickly, I wanted to completely echo and applaud Leanne's comment. I think she nailed it, and so I don't want to take up too much time. And I know others are waiting in the queue, so that's all for now. Thank you.
Thank you. And Jay Raj?
Yeah, thank you all for bringing that issue to light. So yeah, speaking to the racial equity statement, I've noticed sort of an inclination to try to bypass community engagement efforts, specifically sharing how it will extend planning periods and increase costs significantly. I've been hearing the idea of like community engagement fatigue, and there hasn't been a mention of fatigue in any other process, whether it's analysis, planning, or implementation. And so I have concerns about the excuses being made to try and avoid community engagement. And specifically, I have concerns about this on the last page of the racial equity statement analysis on page 18, on the last paragraph, basically saying what I just said about, negatively impacting underserved populations by delaying transportation investments or reducing the available investment amounts. So I just recommend removing that third sentence, specifically stating that. So yeah.
Thank you. Julie?
Julie Warnicki, Transportation Planning Manager for the City of Salem. And I just wanted to respond to something that was just said, at least from my perspective. I don't feel like the city, I don't feel like we're pushing back and not wanting to do engagement and more, broader engagement. It's more that a recognition of the time that's involved, so that when there are very aggressive timelines for implementation of something, then that negatively impacts our ability to do that thorough engagement. And so I just want to make it clear that it's not that we don't want to do the engagement. It's just that the timelines need to recognize that, especially engagement with traditionally underrepresented groups, requires a lot of going out and relationship building and a lot of time.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying that. And Emma?
I just want to say thank you, Leanne, Jay Raj, all the comments just made. I thoroughly agree with those. And as someone who's representing a local jurisdiction and has been asking for timeline extensions and making comments on the process, that is because we feel like we're being asked both to deliver even faster than we've ever delivered a planning process before and do more robust community engagement. We would love to do more robust community engagement, but with limited resources, less time, and asking for more, it just doesn't compute. So that's where those comments are coming from, and we would love to do better community engagement. I acknowledge that public processes have fallen short, have been racist in how they've been set up for generations. So really want to make progress in that area and appreciate both of you speaking up on this. I've been providing comments for the last several RAC meetings saying, hey, 4-hour Zoom meetings, this is not beneficial for anyone. Can we split it into 2-2-hour meetings or have more work groups, have different formats? Because I think the RAC meetings as they've been run, at least the last several, are really not conducive to the desired outcomes and the process that we set up at the beginning.
Yeah, thank you, Emma, and thanks to everyone for just the honesty and their reflections here. Any others, any thoughts, just, responses to what's being said, or any additional thoughts on any of the impact statements here? Yeah, Kevin.
I just want to note that in our follow-up survey, there's an opportunity to comment in more detail. I recognize people haven't had time to review these, and we really do want your comments on the impact statements. So don't feel like it's a speak now or forever hold your peace kind of thing. We'll have some additional time. But thank you. This has been very helpful.
Thanks, Kevin. All right. Okay, so I think with that, we can kind of move into our next steps and wrap up. And I know Kirsten already provided a little bit on this, but I think it's over to you, Kirsten, to just give a little bit of, high level reflection on the process and anything that you want to share from DLCD's perspective. And then we really want to open it up to the group as well for your thoughts and reflections. And the honesty has already come out on the table in the last few comments, which is exactly what I think is needed here. And just want to hear, as we wrap up this part of the rulemaking process, not the whole process, but this part of the rulemaking process, how has it been for you? Reflections on process or reflections on the substance of what's in the rules, any any thoughts you want to provide, and even just messages for the commission. You'll obviously be able to provide your comments to the commission, but is there anything you want to say here, especially with commissioners in the room? So any messages there?
Thanks, Sylvia. Am I on voice?
You're a tiny bit quiet.
Okay. It's the phone machine. I hope that's any better.
Yeah, if you just speak up, then we'll hear you.
Oh, okay. All right. Boy, thanks. So this is going to be a good discussion. I'm going to yield the floor for sure. I would ask folks to differentiate, to be clear and kind of think about this rule development process vis-a-vis the rule implementation. Because I think we're just getting a little confused there in our last discussion. Like, I think Jairaj, if I'm right, was talking about rule implementation, community engagement. But Jairaj, I would welcome your thoughts about, you've stuck through it here through the end. I'd welcome your thoughts about how this has been. We know that 150-page packets are not friendly, and we apologize for that. This is one of the most significant undertakings and updates to the statewide land use planning program that's occurred in, honestly, probably the last 50 years, the entirety of the program. So you've been involved in something that's historic and difficult, and we're very grateful. And I would invite really every member of the RAC to that first hearing to be recognized for your work here, whether you're here as a volunteer, whether you're here as whether you're here as part of your job, whether you are supported by your community-based organization. I would encourage everyone to just come and help commission and staff reflect on how this has been. There are, I think, specific questions in the RAC survey that will come. Hopefully we're distinguishing, so I'd ask staff to make sure to distinguish between the RAC process and then implementation, because they're related, but we want to learn from this RAC process, and we want to fund implementation correctly, fund and sequence implementation correctly. So really appreciate that. I've mentioned the 3 touch points for the budget build process, and then as well, and I'll put those in the chat, and they'll be captured in the notes as well, but the additional thing I mentioned before Commissioner Warren had a chance to join was a probability and an offer to meet with the RAC members who are still left with some energy between the 2 hearings to work on additional refinement. We do want, phone calls, comments, if small group discussions are helpful before January 30 to help folks understand the rules. So again, local government implementers, please pick up the phone and call us if you have questions on the rules. There are some very good questions asked for simply clarification today, and really appreciate those and want to keep those coming. So by additional kind of 11 days to provide written comments on this packet that you received for this meeting, and then staff will be turning that around for legal review, Department of Justice review, the first week of February before filing, so that we can hold our first hearing in March. So again, we know this has been trying and exhausting and monumental all at the same time. We can't thank you enough. You'll probably hear that gratitude from commission, but just want to stop talking, get out of the way here. Thank you, Sylvia. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thanks so much, Kirsten. And anyone else from DLCD have anything to add to that in terms of just next steps or pieces before we kind of open up the floor? Okay, so just want to open it up to folks. Any final thoughts you want to leave DLCD with, or to Commissioner Warren who's listening in here, or to each other, just about this process, the substance of the rules themselves, how this has been for you. Kind of just want to leave space for anything else that you all want to say. All right, see some hands going up. So let's go to Damien and then Jonathan.
All right, thank you. I just wanted to say thank you for the way the process has been facilitated, because I've been appreciate the way the process was facilitated, and I appreciate the more inclusive nature of this process, and including more voices that have not been on these kind of rulemaking committees before. And I speak from some experience where I've been on rulemaking committees where instead of being on a Zoom meeting, I'm trying to participate over a phone and getting yelled at by some stakeholders, lobbyists. And I appreciate being able to get points across, questions answered. So thank you for that.
Thanks, Damien. Jonathan?
Thank you. So I've recognized the real challenge of, operating during this pandemic. That staff have all been having to do this out of their houses. People who are responding are doing it out of their homes. That's difficult. One of the things that I wanted to just talking about the RAC process, one of the things that's been difficult for me is to understand whose voices I'm hearing. That's partly been because one of the main ways that we've gotten feedback during the process is by filling out the surveys, and the surveys have been anonymous. So I read through these, and I'm not sure whose voices I'm hearing. And I've been, so I wanted to kind of comment on thinking about how in this sort of virtual world we can understand who we're hearing from. Obviously during the time when I can actually hear somebody and see somebody, I understand who's talking. But even with our breakout groups, if I'm not in the other breakout groups, I don't know who's being reported on, what's being reported on from whom. So I just wanted I really was eager for this process. I was just going to be an alternate, remember, but I was eager for this process to be able to hear from those voices that we don't hear from. And sometimes I just couldn't tell who I was hearing from. But there was a big challenge for all of us.
Thanks, Jonathan. Appreciate that. Others, and of course, do also want to hear from folks that represent people with lived experience and the community-based organizations. Your voices, of course, have shaped this process so much, and want to make sure that we're leaving space for your thoughts as well. See a hand up from Patricia. Oh, and it looks like you're on mute.
Thank you. I'm Patricia, and I'm with the ARP Oregon, and I'm a volunteer. Our executive director, I've been a RAC alternate, but the assigned staff person has not been able to attend, so I have filled in that. I think the intent was great with the diversity of who was brought to the table. I think what surprised me was partway through, I ended up thinking, well, gosh, maybe there should have been two parts of the RACs, one that was based on the technical specifications, and then another that would continue to say, what does the community want and need? What are the issues with regard to housing and transportation and addressing true accessibility? I think as the process went, getting to some of those community meetings, it ended up happening, but I myself, I know I felt overwhelmed with the level of detail and the 0.01, 0.4, that with all of the rules. So I commend DLCD for what you set out to do, and as Kristen and others have said, that this was really a learning experience and first time, but I have the experience of having worked at the state level and now representing community, and I understand both sides. So hopefully we've learned a lot, but I understand that both pieces were, I think, getting caught in the middle of those who were going to have to be implementing, as well as those who wanted to see their community needs being represented. So I think that's all I can say. It's not an easy thing, and we need to keep raising these issues. And I really want to thank Michael for, and I think he has signed off, but for continuing to bring that whole, not just accessibility, but the acceptability of those housing, transportation, everything. So I think that's all I'll say. I understand both sides, and I'll just look forward to more at the local level and more at the state level. So thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Patricia, for acknowledging that, sort of wanting to have two levels of conversation in the same forum, and it's complicated. And any other thoughts on that, or ways that the process could have been done differently? You know, if we were to step back and redo this, how could we have shaped the process? What would have made it easier to engage, even if it's a wholly different structure than what we've had here? All of those kinds of suggestions, thoughts are great.
Six-day retreat at a just think, I love the call for this wholesale redesign, Sylvia. I come from a background of community engagement and long range planning and working for cities and counties, and the idea of being able to get together and workshop. We had the privilege of working with some really, really great artisans in this arena, James Rojas and others, that use techniques that literally can cut across language, age, income, educational levels, working, with memory and design and building up the rules sort of from there. I mean, if I was to say how to do it again, I'd really love to go back to like the building blocks of community and what's important to people. So just want to thank everyone for sticking with this sort of more traditional process. One question I would ask is, certainly we were able to, for the folks who are with community-based organizations that have support, I know our staff have kind of tried to reach out before the meetings and walk folks through packet. I don't know that was wholly kind of the right fit, and not everyone kind of got that treatment, on a one-to-one basis. So just looking for ways to do it better. Bill, I don't know if you have any thoughts. Bill has been chatting to me on the side, but Bill, I know you're not kind of with a CBO, so you didn't get a call before and after every meeting to say, is there anything you particularly would like to know about?
Are you talking to Bill Grout, me?
Yes, I am.
Yeah.
I am.
So I was just getting ready to raise my hand, so thanks for the shout out. I do know a little bit about the land use planning. I came here to the group knowing that everybody on this group has the strong desire to make a thriving community, and with all of its greatness and its abilities to do that. I look at what DLCD has control over, and I see what we're doing here as the foundation that allows all other organizations who participate in the social determinants of health to make a thriving community. It enables them, and so we have access to food, access to healthcare, access to education. These are not DLCD things, but the rules that we make here allow the planning of a thriving community. And I kind of have to admit that I wish we had done more. We are talking about stuff that is right in front of us, but the rules I see are, go for the next 10 years. My role here in education is to create you a market space of kids now who will be adults in 10 years that will find these new communities that we're designing desirable and economically feasible, wanting to be there, just going for density and vehicle miles traveled as the primary stuff is good, but not enough for me to convince my high school kids that, hey, what you see in Hollywood movies, which is a giant single family home with a large yard, as the American dream. We're trying to change that here, but I don't have enough direction here to push that forward. But this is what enables that, as long as we keep all of the social determinants of health and all the partners in the state that contribute to a thriving community, allows that to happen. So I do see the big effort here. It was great. I really heard a lot. I learned a lot. Participation on the equity side was not there. I strongly don't believe we pushing equitable, affordable housing to all, which we know that is the root of generational wealth. That has been lacking. I don't really see that here, but I'm not sure it's DLCD, and I'm not sure whether these rules enable that and it's other groups that are going to bring it in, or whether these rules are hindering that. So I'm kind of stuck in the middle, and I'll stop there. Thanks for the time.
That's great. Thank you, Bill. Right, others, any other thoughts, reflections before we close out today?
Jeremy.
See a hand up from Jeremy.
Oh. Hey, thanks everyone. Well, I want to thank all the Rulemaking Advisory Committee members and the staff for all of the hard work. And this is a very difficult process. The content is extremely dense. There's so much going on, and we're trying to accomplish so much in each meeting. It's a challenge, but I think everyone did their best to try to shape these. So I appreciate that. One thing I just would mention, I brought this up a few times, and it is just the lack of sort of analysis particularly around the housing pieces of this. I mean, I think we are stuck in this position where we have these desires of creating denser communities that in theory could actually increase the volume of housing production by allowing quite a bit, more of it with density, but not having the information about sort of the realities of development on the ground in the communities that we're trying to achieve this in, and the likely sort of market response to the rules. And it makes it really difficult to know, as Bill mentioned, whether we're helping or hindering some of our goals, which I have no doubt we're all trying to accomplish similar goals, but we don't quite have the information that we need to know if we're actually doing that. So that's just a comment I'd like to make. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeremy.
My question to everybody, put it differently, was it worth it for you? Will you ever get these parts of your life back? Will you? I hope that we, that these rules are not finished. And I think Sylvia's going to turn over to Commissioner Warren here soon. But the obviously, planning is not supposed to be sort of edict function, but we do want to make sure that we, support commission to adopt rules that are built to evolve. Jeremy, we hear you on certainty. We wish we had that information and kind of have some thoughts about that. But, was it worth it? Was the transparency offered worth it? To the CBO folks who will be interviewing with Kearns and West Helps, did it, would you do this again? I'm not sure they would, so we really have to just ask ourselves, was it worth it? This kind of hypothesis of having everybody in the same room where folks would hear from each other, we may not have created enough space for, kind of the folks that need to implement the rules to hear from the community voices, or not the kind of the right forums. Bill was just actually talking about Bill Grubb was kind of talking about a way to bring it down to earth and use some more kind of examples about what the outcomes would look like on the ground. Some of that sort of depiction may have been, I think, more helpful for us to kind of pull apart the model and look at it from a different way. So really open to folks' continued thoughts, whether it's in the room today or afterwards in interviews or on your email. Jairaj, if you're coming back on to say anything, I want to hear it again.
No, yeah, I just want to thank you and Kearns and West and Sylvia and entire staff. For me, I work for a community-based organization, but I also I also have a degree in urban planning, so I have that technical understanding of some of the terminology, but other organizations that I don't see here may be intimidated by all that information and overwhelmed. So I do think, like you were talking about James Rojas, he does excellent has an excellent methodology in engaging the community in these types of processes. There are so many other things like participatory action research that's coming out from the Bay Area to do processes, to enhance processes like this. So I think there's an opportunity to learn more, but I think, from my perspective, with my background, I thought this was a very useful, process for me.
Thank you. Few, not always lost. Thank you, John. All right.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Jayraj. And I will turn it over to Commissioner Warren in a moment. I do want to also just reflect, this has been an incredible process from my perspective. And, I want to commend DLCD for bringing together voices that don't always get to be in the same room together for this long process and kind of work through these really complex issues together. This is going to be a really important piece of how the state grows for the coming years. And so it's been an honor to be a part of this. And of course, just all RAC members, and hearing your intelligence and your wisdom throughout this year and a half has been a real honor. So I want to thank you all for, allowing me to facilitate and help guide some of these conversations. And I want to turn it over then to, well, maybe before Commissioner Warren, just any other, ending on logistics, but any other logistics DLCD staff before we get there? Okay.
I'll just note, well, we're sending out the surveys after the meeting. We'd like comments back by January 31st. That'll allow us to fold those into the draft that we will then be finalizing for Secretary of State. And thank you, everyone, for your engagement today.
Thank you. All right, so Commissioner, over to you to close us out.
Thank you, Sylvia. Sorry, I'm stuck in the library. That's why I've got the mask going on. Huge thank you to everyone, especially DLCD staff and Sylvia and Bianca. You've been amazing. And even bigger thanks to all you volunteer RAC members and RAC members that are paid to be here. You both have been super valuable in this process. But I appreciate your input for today and for the last year. What a heavy lift it has been. And what a journey we've been on. It's been quite the process to be a part of. I am new to the rulemaking process with the state level, so I have learned an immense amount. And I've heard a lot of great guidance come out of this group of people. And I've heard a lot of it and internalized it and really reflected on its meaning and had a chance to interact with a lot of you independently of this meeting and staff about that guidance. So thank you. It has made a difference. We've just heard so much, which has been a huge part, I think, of what staff has been trying to juggle through this whole process is how do we take so many great comments and incorporate them and find that balance that really, I think, is what this process is about. And I can see how that's been frustrating for many of you because we all have our own, bits and pieces in this rule making and things that we find personally important. But then there's also the kind of the opposing side too. So how do we find that balance in the rules? And I really do think that we've done as good a job as we possibly could have done through this process. I also want to apologize for missing half the meeting today. I was stuck in class all morning. But I'm here and I had a chance to hear some of the great questions and comments come out of today's meeting. And I really, really want to show my appreciation for your honesty and reflection about the inequities in this process. It'll be useful for us moving forward about how we reshape the next process, which I'm sure there will be one coming soon. And we'll take it to heart and we will continue to try to do better. I've also been hearing a lot of talk about I think what we find in planning in general is just the difficulty with interaction with the general public. Planning is generally a pretty technical field, and not everybody speaks the same language. And so, continuing to think about how we engage the general public in this conversation in a meaningful way is forefront in my mind, and we'll continue to improve on that. Also, I want to remind you just to fill out the survey. It might be the last one, which is kind of exciting, but they've been super useful and helpful to us. So please do that. A lot of these comments will go to shape the final set of rules that go in front of the commission on February 3rd and 4th. So please do that survey. Continue to flood your comments to us. My email, easy to find, happy to receive more comments there. And I want to invite your continued advocacy in front of the commission as well. We would love to hear from you all. I think it'd be very useful to the commissioners who have not been part of this, because I will try to represent your voices as best I can, but there's so many of them that I can only cover so much. So I'm inviting you to come and be a part of the commission meetings as well. The final commission hearing for this rulemaking is scheduled for May 19th and 20th. At least right now. So keep that on your calendar. Hopefully it'll be an opportunity for us to kind of celebrate this process a little bit more with a passage of rules that we think are going to really help Oregonians moving forward. And with that, just a huge final thank you to you all. I've had a chance to interact with so many of you and appreciate your guidance immensely. And I've learned an immense amount through this process, and I'm looking forward to moving these rules into implementation phase. So thank you again.
All right, thank you, Commissioner, and thanks everyone. Appreciate your time, and have a good rest of your days. And you still have opportunities to comment, and I'm sure that we will cross paths, and it's been a great process. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.